Next on the agenda, we will hear from a panel of presenters speaking on the impacts of firearm violence. Commissioner Bunch is the chair of the Impacts on Firearm Violence Subcommittee and will introduce the panel. As this panel is a little longer, we will be having a short 10-minute break after our fourth panelist. So Commissioner Bunch, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is the second panel presented to the Commission on the IFV project and builds off the cumulative research and community engagement activities of the past year. I'd like to take a moment just to thank Courtney Ackerman for all of her hard work because we've learned so much and she's done an amazing job leading this initiative. In the first panel, the Commission learned about the problem of firearm violence, about the cycle of violence and trauma, the need for support to heal from firearm violence exposure, and heard firsthand about some of the innovative work happening in pockets throughout the state. With this panel, we will continue to focus on the solutions. We'll hear from experts and those with lived experience leading California's violence prevention initiatives at the state and community level. We're excited to hear more about what works, where there are gaps and barriers, and most importantly, where there are opportunities to work collaboratively to address the problem of firearm violence and its associated negative outcomes. Our goal for this panel is to further the discussion and to come away with some direction from the Commission on where to go from here. What should we prioritize in the final report recommendations? And are there questions we still need answered? Since we've learned about the impacts of trauma and the importance of operating in a trauma-informed manner, especially in our roles as advocates for mental health and well-being, we're going to facilitate this panel accordingly. I'd like to introduce our panel facilitator and first presenter, Dr. Richard Espinoza. Dr. Espinoza is a licensed clinical psychologist with expertise in treating exposure to mass violence events. He specializes in multicultural and LGBTQ+ mental health support and is committed to promoting mental health awareness and inclusivity and decreasing stigma. He is also an adjunct professor at multiple colleges and an advocate for empowerment for all. I've had the pleasure of hearing Dr. E present in the past and was amazed by his level of knowledge. Today, Dr. E is going to facilitate the panel and help us all stay present and balanced while we learn. Take it away.
Testing 1, 2. Oh, much better. So once more, yes, my name is Dr. Richard Espinoza, and I want to thank you all for attending this, for inviting me to speak on this matter. I want to, in advance, thank all of the panelists for being here and sharing their expertise as well. I am, again, a licensed clinical psychologist, and I'm also a professor of clinical psychology, and I split my time between those two activities. So I start off with this by just acknowledging that I've been impacted by firearm violence in 2018. I'll be brief with this. I was in a mall and a shooting happened. And so I firsthand got to experience the terror that gets instilled when these events happen. And that's kind of the framework I look at this when I'm looking at the global impact of mass violence. So let me get into what I'm talking about when I talk about mass violence, and then particularly focus on firearm violence. So I'm going to explain my definition of mass violence, again, particularly focusing on firearm violence. Then I'm also going to talk about preventative measures to adapting and avoiding the impacts of mass violence. And then ultimately, I'm going to talk about coping skills to directly deal with the impacts of mass violence. And then I'm going to close out my section of this by facilitating a guided meditative practice that you don't have to participate in, but you're warmly welcome to. So let's get into it. There we go. Okay, so first off, just understanding what mass violence is, and again, its particular place with firearm violence. So mass violence, it encompasses multiple things. It could be shootings, yes, it could be vehicular violence, and it could also be explosives being detonated, and ultimately just acts of terror, because these events are meant to, these attacks are meant to instill terror and incite fear. So if we think about this in particular to the United States, we can think of it as domestic terrorism. as it does instill community-wide fear and can leave us with trauma. And trauma is what we take away from any type of adversity or adverse experiences that we go through. So if we think about it from this framework of mass domestic terrorism happening, we can also understand the interesting cluster of feelings that people tend to be reporting. So it sounds like there's a good amount of mental health clinicians in the room. So if any of you have heard about the impacts that I'm about to speak about, please let me know. Becoming a researcher on the impacts of violence in the United States has ultimately led my career path to becoming a firearm violence researcher, because firearm violence is the #1 form of mass violence that we have in this country. We have basically a shooting every day. Case in point, I've updated the data to, as you'll see on my slide, I've updated the data to how many shootings have happened as of today. When I initially submitted these slides, it was October 6th, so 20 days ago. Sure enough, 20 days later, as I updated this morning, there's been basically 20 more shootings and many more deaths and people impacted and injured from that as a result. For every citizen in this country, we have 1.2 available guns at their disposal. So for every 100 citizens in the United States, we have 120 registered guns available. Emphasis on the word registered. I don't have enough time to talk about ghost guns, but perhaps that'll come up as we continue to talk. So the stats as of today, unfortunately, we have, as of this morning, 565 shootings have taken place in this country, resulting in almost 600 deaths and almost 2,400 people injured by this. If we compare this to last year's data, we had almost 650 shootings, and that resulted in almost 45,000 deaths and almost 40,000 injuries. So I'm coming from Los Angeles, so please don't attack me for my sports analogies, but think about the Staples Center. The Staples Center is about 18,000 capacity. So if we're thinking in terms of the number of people killed by firearms and just injured by that, we could fill roughly 5 Staples Centers for that. So that's a way to really think about the realistic context of all of this. So let me continue. Take your Dramamine if you need to. My slides tend to zoom around, so I'm gonna take you on a ride. So, particular to everyone in this room and many of the people who are probably streaming this online as well, has anyone ever been to a house of worship? Okay. Has anyone been to a place of business? Okay. Who's been to a school? Those are the 3 main places where individuals are at risk for mass violence, particularly firearm violence. So that roughly, if we want to lump that into a type of person who engages in those, we'll just say professionals for the sake of this talk. But again, it's anyone who frequents those 3 main places, which is everyone in this room, it seems like. So for those of us in professional roles, working in mental health, or just being any standard citizen in the United States, we're all at risk for vicarious trauma. So you don't necessarily have to firsthand experience a traumatic event to, if you want to get clinical, to meet the criteria diagnostically for post-traumatic stress disorder. I'm not saying everyone in this room has PTSD right now, but I'm saying we're all at risk for post-traumatic stress. And again, it can happen vicariously. You don't have to firsthand experience it. We see it publicized in the media. We hear conversations about it. Well, we introduced today's conversation here, today's meeting, talking and acknowledging what happened in Maine just last night. So we're all susceptible somehow to vicariously be impacted by this. So one of the first preventative strategies I propose, and this also comes from the research lab I belong to, Health Inequality Studies, actually based in the East Bay, across the bay. Consider developing what's called a violence diet or a violence budget. This is simply consciously acknowledging how much violence you consume on a daily basis. So just start to ask yourself, how many people did I virtually shoot on the video game I played for 6 hours? How many people did I watch get shot in a movie that I really like? I heard about a mass shooting that happened. Do I really need to see the footage in the media? It's just having this conscious awareness on how much you consume, because mass violence, and particularly firearm violence, it's entertaining, unfortunately. So it draws and garners in a lot of attention from all of us. And our attention on anything is a commodity. So I just propose to people with this violence diet in mind, just ask yourself, if you're consuming violent content, ask yourself if you're consuming it for education, which does behoove us often, or is it for entertainment? Especially as everyone in this room as working professionals, it behooves us to stay informed in current events, particularly violence, especially mental health clinicians. But also it can be a little seductive. It can be attractive. It could be entertaining. So just be mindful of these conscious choices you make when you consume violent content. Particular to everyone in this room and the people streaming this as well, people may have fear in their workplace that violence may happen. Again, places of business, which is a pretty broad term, are at significant risk for mass violence. And then as professionals, having to wrestle with our human experience and then being in a professional capacity, it is a challenge to juggle being compassionate towards people impacted, to hold ethics when, especially to my understanding of people in law enforcement, and then also just to understand that safety is a really crucial matter. So we have to juggle all of these things. Every citizen has to juggle and wrestle all of these different hats we wear every day as they're impacted by firearm violence. So as we continue on, I want to talk about effective coping skills for this. And bear in mind, this is a condensed version of a 2 to 3 hour lecture I typically give on this matter. But again, I feel all of these matters will come up as the other panelists speak. So just first off, speaking as a psychologist, this post-traumatic stress I'm talking about that's on a group scale, just learn to spot the warning signs. You don't have to be a mental health clinician to do so. So if you or someone you know is experiencing feelings of being down, depressed, hopeless, irritable, if a person is adopting a high level of negative self-talk or feeling blunted, feeling completely numb emotionally, these are all some of those post-traumatic stress symptoms that should be addressed. So if a person is feeling it, reach out to somebody. If you spot that someone in your circle is feeling that, do your best to hold space for them. Simply just give them an empathic ear, give them a shoulder, a metaphorical shoulder to lean on. And as we talk about coping, think of it on a global scale. So meaning, I always call it the ABCs: affect, behaviors, cognitions. So feelings, actions, and thoughts. Coping involves adjusting and making adjustments to those three areas of our lives. And that's the human condition. We're always thinking, feeling, or doing something. So one other thing I highly propose is to just change our language and our conversation about firearm violence. Raise your hand in the room if you've ever heard a mass shooter joke. Okay, I'm seeing it. Maybe you can raise your virtual hand too if you're streaming. It's very common. It's ubiquitous in our society. I feel we're attempting to cope with the violence we have by maybe trying to hold it with humor, which some mental health research says that can be effective, but with caution. So it really behooves us all just to start acknowledging when firearm violence is brought up even in jokes, because the research shows those who perpetrate mass violence tend to talk about it. They tend to brag about their plans long beforehand. So one of the more frequent forms that comes in our current society and our culture is through humor. So it behooves us all to start taking mass shooter jokes seriously, and this helps us identify potential aggressors. It's just one of a cluster of signs and symptoms we typically see in people who perpetrate this aggressive act. So I will briefly also talk about self-care. So it's good to care for ourselves as we go through all of this. Self-care is one of the most important preventative forms of healthcare service that we can provide for ourselves. So I highly encourage people to adopt what's called self-regulation techniques. And that's basically just us trying to keep our cool, for lack of better terms. So some suggestions that I would give you are maybe finding on your phone and saving some calming images. Research shows that looking at vistas tends to help regulate our stress response. And also just looking at humorous videos not related to the content you're trying to distract yourself from. And it's highly advised to avoid venting on social media, and especially arguing with people on social media about heated topics. Some research shows that up to 60% of the people you're arguing with are robots. So bear that in mind as you engage online. It's also been found effective to develop what's called a regulation buddy. So think of it kind of like your emotion regulation sponsor. If you're feeling dysregulated, identify and form a relationship with someone who can help you in times of need and be able to support them in that same situation for that person, or perhaps joining or forming a regulation group as well. Psychosocial support, so support from our loved ones, is one of the best preventative factors in healing from all forms of healthcare ailments. It's also really good to foster in-person support. So doing all of this can be done in person, but also I call it a good B+ is also virtual engagement with people. That's a pretty effective way to also form this in-person support, but again, it's through virtual means. I also highly encourage people to understand the difference between being prepared and being paranoid. Real quick with that, being paranoid is being distressed over something you can't really prove is going to happen. Being prepared is appropriately preparing for a situation that research shows may happen. So anyone who's concerned about firearm violence and protecting themselves, either psychologically, physically, or preventatively, you're not paranoid. The research shows, and as we see, every day there's a shooting. So it's very realistic. And again, it's preparedness if you are preparing to keep yourself self-regulated, adapt coping skills. And if you find that you're fixating on firearm violence, unfortunately, it's warranted. And with all that said, as I talk about a very colorful topic and may inadvertently dysregulate people as we speak, I would like to invite everyone to engage in a mindful practice. You do not have to participate, but you're welcome to if you want to. So I call these breath pauses. So if your body allows, try your best to have both your feet on the ground and have your hands in anything but a fist. When we make a fist, that tells our central nervous system it's time to fight or fly away. So do anything with your hands, but make a fist. Most people like to place them on their knees if they can. I always like to remind people air is the most free and abundant and accessible mind-altering substance there is. So cash in on it. Okay, now I'll facilitate this. So if you feel comfortable, close your eyes. If you'd like to keep your eyes open, just stare at something that's stationary, staying still. So let's take a big breath in through your nose and actually hold it once you're full. And sigh it out. Good. On your next in-breath, breathe in nice and full. Expand your stomach as you breathe and hold it once you're full again. And sigh it out. 3 more times. Breathe in nice and full. Fill your chest this time. And once you're full, hold it. And sigh it out. 2 more times. Breathe in nice and deep, filling every inch of your body with air. And hold it once you're full. Let's have a nice audible exhale out. Last one, make it your biggest breath of the day. Breathe in. And hold it. Give this one a few more moments. And audible exhale, let it all out. If you can, keep your eyes closed and just acknowledge that you've been breathing this whole time. And notice if your breathing has shifted at all from the beginning of this brief exercise. Notice the temperature of the room around you. Notice the feeling of the ground beneath your feet and the chair beneath you. And as we come back to wakefulness, just bring some gentle movement into your body. Maybe wiggle your toes, your fingers, roll out your neck or your shoulders. And once you feel comfortable, come back and join us. Okay. So I do plan to facilitate one more guided meditation at a later time, but now I would like to introduce the rest of the panelists. Okay. So Nicole Kravitz-Wirtz, PhD and Master's in Public Health, is an associate professor with the Violence Prevention Research Program and the California Firearm Violence Research Center at the University of California, Davis. A program of research and evaluation sits at the intersection of sociology and population health science, utilizing mixed methodologies and participatory research principles to examine human behavior in a larger social and institutional context in the service of fostering equitable and community-centered policies and practices for improving the health and mental health of people and communities who are impacted by structural and community violence. Her work has been published in journals including JAMA, Health Affairs, Social Science and Medicine, Injury Prevention, and Preventative Medicine, and showcased in media outlets such as the New York Times, The Guardian, and NPR. Wow. Great job. Dr. Kravitz-Wirtz has a bachelor's in psychology from UC Berkeley and a master's in public health with a concentration in epidemiology from UCLA and a PhD in sociology from the University of Washington.
Thank you, Dr. Espinoza, for that introduction. Do I just forward the slides here? We're getting some help. Oh, there we go. All right. So I've been tasked with covering 3 topics listed here today, from an overview of the burden of firearm violence in California to its causes and its solutions, including systemic place-based investment approaches to violence prevention and response that have long been uplifted in the most affected communities and are increasingly rooted in a growing evidence base. So let me start with some big picture context just to put a slightly finer point on some of the numbers that Dr. Espinoza has already provided. So first, when we talk about violence, particularly deaths from violence, what we're largely talking about is firearm-related deaths. So firearms account for nearly 3 in 4 homicides and more than 1 in 3 suicides here in the state. Dozens of cities, large and small in the US, and again here in California, have experienced record surges, not so much in crime overall, but in firearm violence in particular since 2019, driven largely by firearm homicides, which increased nearly 50% from just over 1,300 to 1,950 deaths from 2019 to 2021. And for the first time ever, as of 2020, firearms have replaced motor vehicle crashes as the most common cause of death for children and teens in the US overall. And here in California, firearms remain a top 3 leading cause of death for young people. Recent increases in firearm violence have coincided with massive increases in firearm sales and availability over the last few years, which have been linked in prior research to subsequent increases in firearm injury rates. And we don't know the exact number of firearm acquisitions in the US because we don't actually maintain a national database for all types of sales and acquisitions, but we can generate estimates based on data from the FBI's National Instant Background Checks system, which is what are shown in the graphs on these slides for US overall on the top, and then for California more specifically on the bottom. And what these graphics show are that from January 2020 through last month, observed background checks on firearm purchasers, shown by the red lines, have averaged considerably above what we would expect, which are shown by the blue lines. And nationally, the data indicate that we're just now returning to expected levels of firearm sales, though here in California, firearm sales are down, but still largely above what we would expect given past trends. And this increase in firearm acquisition is important because the scientific evidence is very clear and consistent. Ready access to firearms, particularly handguns, is a major risk factor for firearm death and injury. In California, the analyses shown here of a cohort of 26 million residents followed from 2004 to 2016 found that the purchase of a handgun was associated with 8 times higher risk for men and 35 times higher risk for women of firearm suicide compared with non-owners. And the risk was greatest in the first 15 to 30 days after someone acquired a handgun, though more than half of the firearm suicides occurred more than 1 year after that first acquisition. And so this same analysis also found that rates of homicide by firearm were approximately 3 times as high among cohabitants of handgun owners, so people who live with handgun owners, than among cohabitants of non-owners. And among the homicides occurring at home, cohabitants of handgun owners had 7-fold higher rates of being fatally shot by a spouse or an intimate partner, and 84% of those victims were female. Overall, and significantly though, California's rates of firearm suicide and firearm homicide remain among the lowest in the country, positioning us in that lower left quadrant, well below the median rates of firearm suicide and homicide in the US overall. And with the exception of the recent COVID-19 years, while the rest of the country's firearm violence rates have increased over the last 2 decades, as shown by the red line at the top there, California's rate in blue has trended downward, due in part to our state's steady enactment since the late 1980s of a number of firearm violence prevention and suicide prevention policies. Yet the burden of firearm violence, particularly day-to-day incidents of firearm violence in the US and even here in California with our lower rates, is unevenly borne, with minoritized, marginalized, and communities of low wealth, and particularly Black adolescents and young adults shouldering the greatest burden of death, injury, and resultant trauma. As shown on the left, while both all suicide and firearm suicide in California has decreased among individuals identified as white, suicide by all means has increased among both Black and American Indian Alaska Native individuals, and firearm suicide has particularly increased among Black individuals in recent years. And among youth and young adults in particular, Black young people ages 10 to 24 currently have the highest rates of suicide in the state. Relatedly, homicide, particularly firearm homicide, is among the leading causes of death for Latino boys and young men, and the #1 leading cause of death for Black boys and young men ages 15 to 34. The gun homicide rate for Latino males ages 15 to 34 is over 3 times that of their white counterparts, and Black male children and young adults of that same age range have been dying from gun homicides at a rate that is 17 times that of the overall population for at least the past 2 decades shown here. Yet deaths, importantly, capture only a fraction of the toll and the far-reaching effects that firearm violence imposes on all of us. Generally accepted estimates put the number of people who survive firearm injuries at more than double the number of fatalities, especially in cases of firearm assault. And survivors often, as we all know, endure lasting physical impairments and mental health problems such as anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress symptoms. Countless more people live, learn, work, and play in communities and social networks plagued by the collective grief and anticipatory trauma stemming from the threat of firearm violence and by costly efforts to avoid and mitigate that threat, regardless of whether they've experienced violence directly. And these spatially and socially proximate experiences of violence are associated with impairments in cognitive performance, impulse control, attention, sleep, and cortisol response, psychological distress, and greater mental health-related emergency department visits, particularly among children, as well as decreased economic and educational opportunities, housing instability, and social functioning problems. And it's really these broader experiences and impacts of firearm violence that constitute a good portion of the societal burden of this problem, or the so-called widespread community trauma that is often just hovering just under the surface. So structural racism and systemic neighborhood disinvestment have concentrated an unequal share of the prevalence and consequences of firearm violence within low wealth, Black and Latinx communities. And research suggests, for example, that within most cities, about 50% of violence is concentrated within only about 4% of city blocks. And even in areas experiencing high levels of gun violence, most incidents of harm are caused by a tiny fraction of the population. So for example, in Chicago, nearly half of fatal shootings and 70% of non-fatal ones occur among a social network that contains only 6% of the total population of the city. And similarly, closer to home here in Oakland, as well as in New Orleans, 50 to 60% of all homicides occur within a social network that contains less than 1% of the population of those cities. And the neighborhoods most affected by firearm violence are those same neighborhoods that reflect local, state, and federal disinvestment. These neighborhoods have plenty of risk factors that raise the likelihood of violence occurring, and few of the protective factors that could mitigate the effects of frequent violence exposure. And so research by scholars in Chicago and by colleagues of mine at UC Davis suggest that the same communities that already had higher than usual rates of violence and the ones that are the most segregated and economically vulnerable are the very ones that have experienced the brunt of the rise in homicides and shootings since 2019. And this sort of spatial concentration and unequal burden of firearm violence doesn't happen by accident. Rather, these inequities are tied to discriminatory past and current policies and practices that have segregated many Black and brown communities from resources and other systems of support that really form the foundation of safety and health. Research has linked increased firearm violence to residential segregation, income inequality, housing insecurity, and underemployment. Research has also identified a link between concentrated poverty, densely crowded housing, vacant buildings with higher, and all of these things with higher rates of violent crime, including gun homicides. And so given these many systems level and place-based factors that contribute to firearm violence, there's a growing recognition that just like improving public health in other ways, reducing firearm violence requires strategies that comprehensively target the individual, the interpersonal, the community, and the societal levels, with some of the most impactful preventative approaches addressing its social determinants and looking outside traditional systems such as courts or hospitals to tackle the root causes of firearm violence. And this type of upstream approach is consistent with research on the preferences of survivors of violence who overwhelmingly prefer investments in non-punitive crime prevention over criminal legal system responses. It's also consistent with an emerging and growing body of research that elevates the effectiveness of non-carceral public safety investments that put communities at the center and builds their capacity to advance safety, health, and economic opportunities that address and meet residents' social needs. So these next and last two slides provide a curated list of systemic community-centered investments that are grounding in a growing evidence base that are key for preventing and responding to the factors at the root of the root causes of firearm violence and trauma. So while there's many more examples, this list represents a diverse set of locations and distinct approaches focused on strengthening the economic health, the built environment, the social environment, and the civic infrastructure of neighborhoods and cities. For instance, I've already noted how a place's economic health has significant influence on its rates of violence. On the other side of this relationship, however, is a promising body of evidence that demonstrates that by enhancing economic opportunity and reducing inequality within neighborhoods, they can significantly reduce violence as well. Income support policies such as emergency financial assistance, cash transfers, low-income housing tax credits, and housing subsidies have been shown to reduce multiple forms of violence. Evidence also shows that youth workforce development and employment programs can reduce youth exposure and involvement in violence by as much as 45%. So additional strength-based strategies with a growing evidence base include those that nurture community and social cohesion, including community violence intervention or CVI programs. These models or CVI models vary, but each looks to community to take the lead in life-sustaining efforts to intervene, prevent violence, and promote healing, generally relying on community-based outreach workers or credible messengers. These are trained frontline staff who respond to and de-escalate emergent or ongoing conflicts, broker peace between individuals and groups, and overcome individuals' distrust of and disconnection from mainstream institutional supports, because they're familiar with and recognized by the people and the resources in the communities they serve, and often share common experiences, such as growing up in similar environments or navigating their own trauma in the aftermath of violence. Similarly, health-focused first responders to non-emergency calls involving mental or behavioral health crises, as well as responses to intoxication, substance abuse, homelessness, have been shown to substantially reduce harm and low-level crime. These are unarmed responders who can respond by themselves or in concert with law enforcement, depending on the incident. Finally, these types of community-based violence prevention and interventions require the leadership of community-based organizations. But these organizations have long been employing bottom-up solutions to safety, especially in disinvested neighborhoods, but they often are routinely underfunded. And so enhancing the capacity of community-based organizations is key. And research has shown that in any given city with 100,000 residents, every 10 additional community organizations dedicated to building stronger neighborhoods and confronting violence is associated with a 9% reduction in the murder rate and a 6% reduction in the violent crime rate. Research also shows that community-based organizations dedicated to fostering collective efficacy and social cohesion can fuel crime reductions, and that these organizations are most effective when they have geographic and cultural ties to specific neighborhoods. So these types of systems level community-centered approaches to violence prevention represent really a first step toward addressing safety and opportunity gaps, as well as for giving all the communities the safety and health and well-being that they deserve. Thanks so much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for further exploring and delving more into the community-wide impact that firearm violence has. And thank you so much for proposing best ways to adjust this. It sounds like it's a culmination of community-wide intervention, reducing poverty status for individuals, and just allowing a space for members impacted by a community to have a place where their concerns will be heard and will be taken seriously, it sounds like. Thank you so much, Professor. All right. Now I'm going to introduce our next impressive panelist. Just reading all of these, it's such an impressive panel. I'm very happy to read this off. So next, Sam Vaughn serves as Neighborhood Safety Director of the Office of Neighborhood Safety, ONS, Deputy Director of the Community Services Department. He is a committed mentor for violence-prone youth in what was once one of the top 10 most dangerous cities in the country. His experiences being mentored by elders while incarcerated for a decade inspired him to become a community leader and help other young men avoid his fate. Believing that traumatized youth will make better choices for themselves and their communities when able to visualize a healthier path and given a continuous support network, the ONS Fellowship Program serves as surrogate family for these young men. Over 70% of the ONS fellows have stayed away from firearm violence and now live with much more hope and promise. Meanwhile, Richmond's homicide rate has plummeted.
Thank you very much for having me here. Glad to follow the doc. Everything that she's saying about the work is proven in Richmond. So the Office of Neighborhood Safety was created in 2007 for the sole purpose to reduce cyclical and retaliatory gun violence, because that was the major factor of gun violence in the city of Richmond. There's always interpersonal or domestic violence sometimes, but we had communities that were war zones and that were feuding, and a lot of bodies was just dropping continuously, daily. So in 2007, we had 43 homicides with a firearm and 242 shootings with the surviving victim. And like the doc said, that was happening in very small pockets. So these people were just dealing with this consistently over and over again. So the city decided to do something. I know the doc said that it's important to invest in CBOs to do this work. I'm a firm believer, it should be government. You don't have to fight for the funding. You can give good jobs, good careers. Folks can be invested in it, because one of the biggest issues with this work is finding the right people, but then continuing to have a relationship with them. Our office started out with 4 outreach workers, went to 7, and there's 3 of us that's been there for 15 years. And so that builds a lot of credibility, builds a lot of trust, builds a lot of relationships, because we're government. So initially folks just, you police, drive around in California exempt cars. So it's a hard sell, but it took us a while. But with continued investment and continued resources, we were able to do some amazing things in the city of Richmond. And so, as I said, our primary goal, period, only thing we're focused on is reducing gun violence in the city of Richmond. We had our first outreach workers hit the street April of 2008 in one of those small pockets that had like 50% of the homicides the prior year. And we just did outreach, focus, build relationships, provide referrals for resources. There's a lot of resources in cities like this. The numbers raise a lot of resources, but it very rarely hits the ones that are most responsible for gun violence. So not to say that the other folks who are receiving the resources don't deserve it, don't need it, but it doesn't do anything to reduce gun violence in the city. And we started realizing that. And so we had to figure out a way to raise our own resources so we can make sure that they were getting to the folks who needed it the most. It's difficult. It's not very palatable to look at perpetrators of gun violence and try to give them what they need. But we've always understood that every perpetrator of gun violence that I've ever worked with was first a victim. And when you live in a community where it's just very traumatic and nothing seems to be done, because in most of these communities, like 10%, maybe less of gun violence gets solved. And so now you're like, okay, police can't keep me safe. This dude's still out here. So it's really a matter of, like, as long as he's around, me and my family or me and my friends are in danger. And so eliminate the threat. And so understanding that, we knew that we had to get very, very close to those folks who were I looked at them like the Green Beret of their communities, because community violence doesn't involve the entire community. The entire community is involved with the after effects of it, but there's very few. And as the doc said, like, We realized that in 2007, 2009, when we were bringing up our Operation Peacemaker Fellowship, out of the 200 plus shootings that happened that year, we felt like it was 27 people responsible for the majority of them. And so we decided to deal with those 27 people much differently. And we created our Operation Peacemaker Fellowship from that. But I tell the street outreach and the Operation Peacemaker Fellowship kind of side by side, because it's important to tell the whole story too, because you got to engage other folks around that specific individual, mother, son, brother, cousins, a parent, a baby mama, all of those types of things, so you can have access to him, have access to that individual's movement, be able to get information about him that he may not want to give you, but the mama does, the baby mama will. So we keep track of all of those hours and contacts, because we want people who are wanting to invest in this work to be able to understand it's a long-term investment. You very well may not see results the way you want to see them, because like I said, in 2008, we had a good year, 50% reduction, and only 3 homicides where there was 28 in that specific place where we were outreaching, and the city felt like they had the answer. It was like, that's great, now do it the entire city, but with the same resources. And in 2009, it went right back up to 45 homicides by firearm and 220 some odd shootings. So that's when we knew we had to do something different. We weren't going to get any more resources, so we had to figure out how to best stretch the resources that we had to make sure that we were fulfilling our obligation to the city. And so the Peacemaker Fellowship, the framework is, and we called it a fellowship intentionally, because we wanted them to feel important. We wanted them to feel like they were part of something that they could never not be a part of again. It was like a fraternity. And so built the relationships with those individuals, built relationships with their families, went out and raised resources to be able to pour into them and give them what we felt every child in a healthy environment would get. You know, you got somebody who cares for you, gonna mentor you. There's nothing you can do to push them away. We're gonna find resources that's works for you. We were dealing with a lot of organizations that did not have the capacity to deal with these individuals, and it was very, very clear. You got a drug problem, and you finally get to a place where you admit it, and we find some place to take you, because that's not our expertise. But they tell you they love to have you there, they want to help you, but come back when you're not high. And if he could do that, like, he wouldn't need to go to that organization. And so we had to bring everything in-house. We brought everything in-house. We let them know that their accomplishments are rewarded, just like any child in a healthy environment. You come home with straight A's, your family rewards that. So we have a stipend available for them after they complete life map action goals. But we let them dictate what their life's supposed to be, because everybody's always told them what they had to do. They hate authority, because they live in an authoritarian society. And so they move in the shadows because they just don't like being told what to do. So it's very difficult for them to allow you to go into the shadows with them, and you can't bring the light. But you stay in there long enough with them, you can kind of pull them into the light, because it's very difficult to change. And when you don't care about yourself, when you don't see a future, like, you don't really care about your decisions, because you live in a hopeless process that you never feel is going to change. So we make this an 18-month fellowship, and I've had folks go through 2, and that's okay. I had one fella go through 3, and that's okay. You keep on needing us, we're gonna keep on being there for you. We make sure they see something other than Richmond. So we've taken them all over the place: New York, Miami, Dallas, Cape Town, South Africa, Jamaica, Ecuador. Like, we want them to see life is bigger. We want to blow their mind about what the possibilities of life is because when you say, I don't really give a, you're gonna make decisions like you don't care about nothing. But when you start caring, you start making better decisions because you've invested in yourself and you don't want to throw away all that hard work. So that's the fellowship. Interns, we put them around elders, stipends, but the biggest portion of that is finding the way to build that healthy relationship with a caring adult that'll never turn its back on you. And realizing for the most part as a credible messenger, they've gone through some things and made it through. So they can prove, right? You can do it if you invest in yourself. You can do it. So, but the relationship is key. None of these other things matter if the relationship isn't healthy. If you're just trying to buy a kid, they like things. So if you're just trying to give them things, they'll take things. They'll take advantage of you. They all do it. They take advantage of us, but then they learn, take advantage of us. All right, you stole the phone. I get it. You did this. You lied on. All right. And so they'll work us, and we let them because we need to build that relationship. And then it shows them like we ain't going nowhere. I'm gonna be a little bit more, leery with you. I ain't leaving my phone out again, but I got you. And then they learn how to take advantage of us, and then their life changes. Sorry. And so what it's not, we're not embracing, encouraging, or promoting any kind of criminal behavior. We're not. We're letting them know that what they're doing is unacceptable, but we understand, right? And so we try to help them understand so it becomes unacceptable to them as well. We're not paying criminals to behave. That was we was hearing that so much. But we were giving them what they need, like basic needs. You wouldn't believe what a fridge full of groceries would do for a relationship. And it don't take much. And we spend a lot of money on crime and public safety, but we don't ever get the results we're looking for. So it's time to think about different ways of investment in communities. And the city of Richmond was innovative. They've done that. Because of our results, there's been 40 plus offices of violence prevention across the country. The White House just created one. The state just created one. So it's becoming believable that there's a different type of way to deal with these kinds of incidents without needing law enforcement. And so we've done the data. He spoke on some of it. We've had 7 cohorts. 96% of our fellows are alive. And it's saying a lot because when we create our fellowship, we're looking at in the next 6 months, who do we think is going to die? And who do we think is going to do it? And it's the same names, either whoever gets lucky first. But so we engage, we go after them, and we give them everything that we can to keep them alive. And so that number in itself is huge. And it's always hard to describe or, how do you know? It's hard to do research on things that you can't, it's not tangible, so to speak. But if you get creative, it is tangible, because our city had average 37 homicides for the 20 years prior to the office being open. And if you add 20 years, since the office has been open for 15 years, like if you added 37 up times those 15, and then actually added the homicides that happened in our city, the difference is the number of fellows that we engaged over those 7 cohorts, the ones that made it, the ones that didn't die. I see that as being tangible. We lost 1 fellow this last cohort, and we realized that every time there's a shooting, biggest issue is another shooter being created because you took something from them that they can't never get back. And that's a dark place to be. And we're dealing with serious mental health in our community, serious insecurities. And like they want to feel valued. And this is one way that they began to feel valued, as we're trying to strip that away. And so these are the numbers of the fellowship engagement. Like you gotta spend a lot of time, you gotta spend a lot of energy, you gotta spend a lot of resources, and you gotta have the right people. And so, with that, I just like to say, as we were talking about youth We've been investing a lot in the youth because that was a big part of our numbers. And we've only had 3 underage 18 homicides in the last 77 months. 3 too many, but still, our data doesn't look like the majority of urban America because we're doing something different. And so with that, I'll just close with, to date, as of October 26th, we've had 6 firearm-related homicides in the city of Richmond and 27 shootings with an injury. And still, that's not healthy. But when you compare that to the 45 and 220 or 43 and 242, it's a safer city. And you can tell, like they farmers markets and they doing all kind of stuff that they wouldn't normally do, jazz festivals. You're not doing that when there's shootings every day in that community. And so, yeah, the community's safer and the entire community's benefited from it. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Director Vaughn, for that. I just want to note and tie everything together as we go along. It's really wonderful to see how the research is understood, see how the statistics come out, and to see the proposal that comes like as a result of Professor Kravitz-Wirtz's work of community impact and how to actually implement it. It's even more wonderful to see it actually be implemented in your work, Director Vaughn. I also need to take a moment to appreciate and highlight the beautiful alchemy that you've gone through. From what it sounds like from your introduction, you've benefited from elders holding space for you, providing mentorship in a volatile environment, in a violent environment. And you're able to actually grow from that, take something from that, and then actually transcend, pass it on to your fellow community and outward. So I just need to acknowledge the beautiful alchemy that is. So with that all said, I would love to introduce the next impressive panelist. This is really impressive. Now it's really good to see now actual voice from the youth that we're talking about so much. I don't believe I said this earlier, but the #1 cause of death for youth ages 0 to 19 is firearm violence. So it's good to see someone adjacent to that population now speaking here for this. So Janiesha Grisham is 23 years old and serves as a violence prevention educator, VPE, for Teens on Target at Youth Alive. Janiesha shared that she has been a VPE since August of last year and actually was a part of TNT in high school. Janiesha joined TNT, that's Teens on Target, as a way to be part of a safe space where students like her were able to be free. Her activities outside of work consist of trying to take care of her mental health, all of us, because sometimes the work she does can affect that. That may just look like playing video games, building Legos, or exploring new places. She realized that she has to take care of herself, excellent, before she can efficiently, take care of the students she serves. Right now, her future work is the work she does at Teens on Target. Ever since she was young, she wanted to help people, and she currently is doing that, so she definitely loves the path that she's on.
Hello, everyone. I just want to apologize because I feel like I'm not going to sound like everybody else on this panel, but I feel like that's why I was invited. So just bear with me, please. Okay. So my name is Janiesha Grisham. I'm actually 24 years old now, but I am a violence prevention educator for the nonprofit organization Youth Alive. I want to give a little background about myself. I was born in Sacramento, California, but I was raised in Oakland my whole life. 4 out of the 7 days out of the week, I actually was traveling from Sacramento to Oakland just to attend my church home. So I'm rooted here. I attended Markham Elementary on 73rd in Oakland. I attended Frick Middle School on 64th, and I graduated from Castlemont High School, which is on 82nd. And it is in a part of Oakland known as the Deep East Oakland, which is one of the most, I think you used the word earlier, Dr. Wirtz, structural disadvantaged part of the city. Yeah, so I say that to say my whole life is rooted in Oakland. It's where I grew up at. I tried to go to college in Texas and it didn't work. I said I want to come back home, and coming back home led me to doing the work that I do now. Before my 6th grade year at Frick Middle School, I lost my brother, unfortunately, December 31st, 2010, on my front porch of my home. My sister was shot in her foot. Luckily, she survived. But me, my mother, my 5-month-old niece, him and my sister were all in attendance. So as a family, we all seen this tragedy happen in front of our eyes, right? Which is why I think I'm here to kind of keep you, I am somebody who is impacted personally by gun violence. So after this event, I just went to school. I grew up in a community that shows you to heal yourself. Don't tell anybody anything. You can do it yourself. You got it. So while my mom started doing her advocacy work, her activism work, and helping mothers, helping families with this same tragedy happening in their life, I did not, because I was so young. So I went to school. I tried to do what I could do, and I just tried to live life. Unfortunately, that didn't work too much because I was in middle school, but this leads me to my experience with my mental health. I can sum it up to one word. It absolutely was horrible. It sucked. When I attended Frick in 6th or 7th grade, my friends were so worried about me because I tried to commit suicide. And unfortunately, that was the only way I can get a therapist at the time because the wait list was so long. So I sat down with her. I tried to get into it, but it just wasn't for me. I don't think I was ready. And I also don't think I could receive the information from the therapist that I had because she didn't look like me. She didn't come where I came from, and she couldn't understand me. So I gave it a minute. I tried to get in high school. I actually don't really remember this therapist. I don't remember talking to her. I just remember her prescribing me, medication for my now diagnosed anxiety and major depression. But ultimately, that did nothing for me either. So it wasn't until I joined Teens on Target in high school that I feel like I actually was able to start healing with my mentors and the credible messengers in my community, because I was able to do it freely and I was understood. My pain was understood. So now my road to youth alive, it was actually very simple. I was in a shift in my life. I was leaving my old job, but I was dealing with depression, anxiety about where I was going in life because I wasn't on the path that I thought I would be on. But through making lifelong impressions and keeping in touch with my mentors actually from Teens on Target when I was in high school, I was able to learn that they were hiring for the exact same position that I was learning from at that time. It wasn't easy for me. Like I said in my bio, I really do focus on my mental health now, but at that time, I was at a space where I feel like I couldn't give the nurturing and loving and caring spirit that my mentors gave me. So I had to sit for a while and think if I could come do this work the same way that they did for me. And now here I am. So Youth Alive. Youth Alive is a nonprofit organization that was founded in 1981, whose mission is to break the cycle of violence and uplift a thriving community of leaders rooted in Oakland and beyond through prevention, intervention, and healing. I would like to say that Youth Alive started off with only about 15 to 20 workers, and now we are an organization that holds about 80 70 staff. So we've grown a lot over the years, which means we are able to do more. We do achieve our mission through our 7 programs. For prevention, we have Teens on Target, which is who I work for. Teens on Target brings together students from Oakland's neighborhood to learn to honor their experiences and their stories. We do this because we want to uplift the youth to use their experiences as a tool for change, to make change, and to teach their younger peers in middle school to avoid and prevent violence in their neighborhood. Next, we have advocacy. So in order to push for permanent systemic solutions to the daily violence in our community, our advocacy for change raises the voices of people most affected by violence. I would like to highlight in the last year, through advocacy, we were able to pass AB 1929, which is Medical for Violence Prevention Services, which allows Medicaid to reimburse violence prevention services. Our advocacy department was pivotal in securing this policy change, with our staff testifying at the state capitol and meeting with state senators. Next, we have our intervention, which consists of Caught in the Crossfire. They are a hospital-based intervention program where our staff meets, they meet victims of violence at the hospital, at their bedside. So they get a call, somebody's in the hospital because of this, they show up where it's most needed. Because when that happened to me, to my brother, we didn't have anybody show up for our family. There was nobody from the community who showed up and said, we know what happened to you, we know what you need, here's what we can do. Next, we have our team of violence interrupters, who are a team that take to the streets of Oakland, heading to whatever violent conflict or escalation is rising to bring alternative and peaceful solutions. I would also like to highlight that our violence interrupters, are usually people from the community where they serve. So we're rooted in Oakland. All of our VIs are from Oakland, surrounded areas, but mostly from Oakland. I also would like to highlight that in 2022, our violence interrupters conducted 219 mediations and resolved 164 with no further violence. Next, we have our pathways. It is a Youth Alive school-based mentoring case management program for at-youth risk, who we know have exposure to violence. They may be on probation or just leaving incarceration. Lastly, for intervention, we have, sorry about that. Now we're moving on to healing. For healing, we have the Gaddafi Washington Project. This is one of my favorites. I feel like this is very much needed in our community. So KWP sends crisis responders into the immediate aftermath of each Oakland homicide to support families of the victims. This can look like emergency financial assistance, relocation services, or even just helping plan funerals. Funerals are very expensive. Caskets can cost up to $2,000 to $20,000, and I'm sure more expensive. My mom kept me away from those prices at that time, but the financial burden that comes with the violence in our community, ultimately, it does not help with the mental health that we are talking about. Lastly, we have counseling, a team of mental health counselors who take their therapeutic services into the field, meeting survivors wherever they may feel safe and comfortable. Some of my students from our program have actually been referred to our therapist, and they'll take our students out bowling, out to eat. Literally, we mean wherever somebody may feel comfortable. So that is Youth Alive. I would like to highlight that all of our services are free for anybody in the community, and we work with anybody. So let's address the issue. I want to point out that our mental health challenges in Oakland are not new. It's been passed down from generation to generation, generational trauma. We've never had a space for healing. It was always, this happened, let's move on, do it yourself. You might get healing in the household with your family and your peers, but other than that, there was no coping mechanisms, no self-care guidance, nothing. And now with COVID-19 happened, everything was shut down. So we sat for about 2 to 3 years, however long you want to say COVID lasted, with self-isolation, social anxiety. Now we don't even know how to go ask somebody for the help that we need, because we've learned to do it ourselves within the last 2 years. So what does the community need from us? Before I did this slide and put this presentation together, I sat down with my students and I specifically asked them, what do you think we need? So I'm going to let you know that this is coming from the youth in our community. First, we have support spreading resources. I sat down with my supervisor about this one, and I actually we need more resources at first. And she was like, I don't think that's correct. I don't think that's what's actually happening. I think when we have these resource fairs that give other options for therapists or housing or anything of that nature, nobody shows up because it's not geared for the people that we actually want to reach. My students, I work at Skyline, Castlemont, and Fremont, and I asked all of my students, how much access do you have to therapy or counselors? And they told me that their wait list is about 6 months to a year, right? A lot of these students, a lot of parents, they don't have health insurance. They barely have Medi-Cal, probably don't have Kaiser. So after your school or somebody, a trusted institution tells you no and doesn't give you any follow-up, like here's another program you can go to. I know this happens in the community. I know somebody works here. We don't have that. So right after somebody's told no, it's like, okay, find your own way, right? Yeah. So secondly, we need more credible messengers, right? So credible messengers are neighborhood leaders, experienced youth advocates, and individuals with relevant life experiences whose role is to help youth transform attitudes and behaviors around violence. I don't like to say I am, but I literally am a credible messenger. And you don't know how many times I hear my students say, we need more of you, not just in an after school program, because I can only be there for my students from 3:30 to 5. Obviously after that, but that's when I can see them and talk to them. But what happens after that when they go back home to the place that's causing all this trauma, right? So we need more of us. In high schools, there are a lot of internships and apprenticeships, I feel like, that are geared towards becoming a doctor, becoming a lawyer. You have sports, becoming a football player, basketball player, but nobody ever teaches our youth that we can be healers in our community, that we can be the healing that we need. We don't introduce this possibility that much. And I believe that peer guided healing is one of the most important forms of healing that we can have, whether it is impacted after gun violence or even in general. We don't have a class in high school that just teaches us how to be a better friend, and I think that is something that is so simple and preventative for the solutions, the problem, trying to find a solution. Excuse me. And lastly, I have that we must create a real safe space for voices to be heard. Now, our after school program is a safe space, right? Like I said, we do hire credible messengers to create that safe space, people from the community who know what happened in the community, who understand our community. But we only have an office. We don't have a space. Like my safe space that I can create for my students is in a classroom where they've been sitting for about 15 hours, sorry, exaggerating, for about 8 hours of the day. And who wants to sit in there and then talk about the trauma? And it is a safe space, but it's not a real safe space. Mr. Sam Vaughn, I know you work at Richmond. There's a community center called Rise in Richmond that I really appreciate, and I really feel like we need in Oakland. They have washing machines. They basically have a hospital in the back. They have TVs, a kitchen. When you need to cook, I believe they'll buy you the ingredients that you need, and you can just go cook whenever the center is open. We don't have that. And that is the place where our credible messengers need to be, in a safe space outside of the homes, out in the community, but surrounded by the community. When I was growing up, I always heard the term that children are raised by a village. And right now, I feel like we do not have that village anymore, especially with COVID hitting. Everybody just separated, became do-it-yourself people. So I remember walking down the street and this lady, my next neighbor across the street would be like, hey, what are you doing? I know your mom. I don't think you should be doing that. We don't have that. So I think that would be great for a safe space so everybody can come together and get to know each other in times like this, because how can you heal if you don't see an example of somebody who has been healed before? I think that is pivotal in these times, especially. And Youth Alive really does do a good job at tackling all these things, these concerns that the community does need. In our work emails, we spread resource fairs, community engagement, where you can go get a free haircut, and we send that out to our clients. We are credible messengers. Me and my coworker actually were both in Teens on Target before we were hired for Teens on Target. And we try to create a safe space for our children wherever we go, because we know right now it's almost impossible to find. But we create these spaces so our children, our adults, can feel the need to spark some change in our society, whether it be following mental health or just getting on the Capitol steps just to say a few words about how they feel. we need to put our community in these spaces, right? Because if I wasn't here, how would you know how a person from Oakland felt going through the impacts of gun violence, right? But maybe it shouldn't have been me. It maybe should have been one of my students who's currently going through the issues. So with that, I do want to say thank you, but I do want to reiterate that now is the time for healing for our community. And I do believe, and my students do believe, that these are the 3 best ways just to start somewhere. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Janiesha, for sharing, first off, just your personal experience of living with the actual impacts, mental health impacts of firearm violence within your community. It's one thing for us to talk about it, talk about the stats, quantify and collate it, and then to actually hear a person from those impacted communities share their experience and their healing. Really powerful. I also would like to highlight the underlying tone of the necessity for evidence-based practice. So a couple years ago in 2021, the American Psychological Association helped redefine evidence-based practice under what they call the tripartite model. So picture just a bar stool with 3 chairs with 3 legs standing on its own. Those 3 main pillars of this framework are relevant current literature on a topic, which we have, like from researchers such as, professor next to me. So besides relevant literature, there needs to be also clinical expertise. So I really want to appreciate you highlighting the need for credible messengers, people with actual expertise, knowledge, training, and maybe a personal experience actually sharing this information. And then the third part of that tripartite model is being culturally responsive. So taking into account the people you're actually working with. Yes, the textbooks say one thing, but what do these humans actually say as a result of this? So again, I just want to highlight the beauty, again, I'm using that word a lot, the beauty in people actually impacted by the communities, people actually living these statistics we see in the textbooks and actually noting how we need to tailor these interventions towards the people we're actually working with, taking into account their intersections. So again, thank you very much for highlighting the need for evidence-based practice. Now, to my understanding, I think we're about to take a 10-minute break. Is it 10 minutes? Okay, so let's take a 10-minute break and then we'll adjourn or we'll resume.
Dr. Espinoza.
Okay, we're going to come back together. I got quiet so fast. I wish my students were like this. Okay, so we're going to continue on and I'm going to introduce our next panelist. Freilich, Juris Doctorate, was appointed as the first director of the California Department of Justice's newly created Office of Gun Violence Prevention earlier this year. Previously, he spent the majority of his career working as an attorney, advocate, and state policy director for Giffords Law Center to prevent gun violence. The Gun Violence Prevention Organization led to former Congresswoman and gun violence survivor Gabby Giffords, where he helped develop, draft, enact, and implement many gun violence prevention bills and programs. Previously, Ari also worked as a legal fellow at a veterans advocacy organization and legal aid clinic focused on mental health policy and the military justice system's punitive treatment of mental injury and attempted suicide. Thank you so much.
Good morning. So my name is Ari Freilich. Like you said, thank you, Dr. Espinoza. I spent my career focused on policy work centered on harm reduction, violence prevention, community safety, and work with people who have suffered the trauma and loss of violence. Since earlier this year, I've had the privilege of serving as the director of California DOJ's newly established Office of Gun Violence Prevention. It's an honor to be with you today, and I appreciate the focus on this topic. The Attorney General established our new office, very small team, but with the mission of supporting data and impact-driven efforts to prevent gun violence and related harms. In other words, to be as helpful as we can to as many people as we can, working to implement, coordinate, understand this issue and spotlight gaps in best practices. We're fortunate to live in a state that has been committed to ongoing action in this area. And as I'll discuss more in a few moments, we've made really significant progress in many areas of the long term that stands apart from national trends that didn't happen by accident. But many of our state's policy developments, our local investments in violence intervention are still very recent. Many are still in the process of implementation and transition from pilot program approaches to more permanent and integrated component of our health, safety, and victim service systems. And with new laws and programs also come new challenges and ongoing responsibilities across so many different agencies, communities, and stakeholder groups. The bill signing, the budget appropriation is so often just the beginning of the work needed to increase safety. Our office was founded to support folks working on those efforts. Earlier this year, we published a data report on the impact of gun violence in California. I'm going to spend a few moments discussing some of the top line takeaways and recommendations from that report, which will echo much of what you've heard today already and add some additional commentary. Some of the takeaways I'll highlight are: first, our state's enormous long-term progress in reducing gun violence. Second, significant challenges we and the rest of the nation have faced since the start of the pandemic. Third, the enormous disparities in access to safety experienced by different communities across our state. Fourth, the need to focus on expanding and systematically integrating community violence intervention and prevention services, especially for gun assault survivors, into our public health, safety, and victim service systems. And fifth, I'll close by spotlighting some exciting, important new opportunities created by recently enacted legislation. I'm going to talk about some statistics and numbers, and want to just start by grounding this in a recognition that many of us know too well: the names, the character, the personality behind these numbers. Gun violence statistics are impersonal, gun violence is not. But I do want to present these numbers to share some of our long-term progress and recent trends. It is important to acknowledge how far we have come in our state because we have a foundation of effective programs to build on, protect, and implement. This didn't get enough attention at the time, but just before the pandemic in 2019, California was setting records for gun safety. That year, we achieved the lowest gun death rate ever recorded for the state in CDC data going back over half a century. To say that again, 2019 had the lowest gun death rate in California on record. We weren't always a leader in this space. 30 years ago, California's gun homicide rate was the third highest in the country. We were an outlier for the wrong reasons. Our gun homicide rate was over 50% higher than the rest of the nation per capita. And at the time, our gun suicide rate closely matched the rest of the nation. By last year, California had the 7th lowest gun death rate in the country. Gun homicides were 33% below the rest of the nation, and gun suicides were less than half the rate of the rest of the nation. For youth under 25, our state made almost uninterrupted progress for most of the past decade and a half in reducing gun homicides. Even after significant pandemic era increases, between 2006 and 2022, California cut youth gun homicides about in half, reduced by 49%, while the rest of the US experienced a nearly 40% increase. We are rowing in a different and in a safer direction. And one way of thinking about this data in context is to ask, what if? If the rest of the US had the same gun death rate as California over the last decade, there would have been nearly 140,000 fewer Americans killed by gunshot wounds in a single decade alone. Hundreds of thousands more non-fatal shootings could have been prevented. And conversely, if California had the same gun death rate as the rest of the US, we would have lost nearly 19,000 people to gunshot wounds in that decade alone. Tens of thousands more of our state residents would likely have been shot, but survived to face life-altering injuries, both physical and mental. Despite this progress, our state and the rest of the nation have faced significant spikes in gun homicide and related harms since the start of the pandemic. In 2020, at the national level, as the doctor referenced, the US suffered the largest single-year spike in homicides on record, driven by a 35% single-year increase in gun homicide rates in just 1 year. In California, the spike in violence started in March 2020, continued to increase almost continuously month over month for the remainder of that year and remained at elevated levels since. California suffered 99 gun homicides in February 2020 and 199 in January 2021. Homicide data alone, of course, doesn't capture the full scope of harm and impact. Just one example, from 2019 to 2021, California law enforcement agencies reported an 80% increase in the number of domestic violence calls for assistance, like 911 calls, reporting the use or threatened use of firearms in a domestic violence incident. It's the highest number of firearm-related domestic violence calls for help since 1995. There are significant increases in other indicators of violence, including hate crimes involving firearms, too. In short, since the start of the pandemic, many more people faced exposure to gun violence-related threats, shootings, traumas. Much of the public's attention on this crisis is understandably driven by high-profile mass violence, like the devastating attack we saw in Maine last night. These have become much more frequent and more frequently high casualty on average across the United States. Many mass shooters exhibit warning signs of ideation, planning, and risk, which offer important opportunities for proactive intervention through a spectrum of responses ranging from crisis intervention, mental health, civil court protection and restraining orders that in California may include provisions to disarm people on a temporary or permanent basis who are found to pose a significant danger to themselves or others, as well as law enforcement and criminal responses too. There's also a strong link between domestic violence and mass shooting risk. In 68% of mass shootings, the shooter has had a history of domestic violence and or killed one or more family members or intimate partners in their attack. Understanding this full spectrum of intervention options to prevent these shootings, all the safety tools in the toolkit to prevent harm is vital for safety. It's also important to understand that these horrific incidents of mass violence, which drive much of the narrative and policy focus around gun violence prevention, represent about 3% of the nation's total gun homicides. That underscores the broader societal impact of gun violence is truly enormous, including thousands upon thousands of both fatal and non-fatal shootings that may never make the news. When we're talking about the impact of all these shootings that do not make the headlines, we also have to talk very clearly about racial and socioeconomic inequality in access to safety, again, echoing much of what you heard earlier. While gun violence harms all communities, its toll and traumas are not borne evenly. From 2020 to 2021, 5% of teenage boys' deaths who are identified as white in America were caused by gun homicide. So it's 5% of white teenage boys who died from a gun homicide. That's a number that would be unheard of in nearly every other high-income nation on Earth. It's similar to the number of white teenage boys who died from cancer, but 4 times as many who died from COVID-19. But the percentage of deaths caused by gun homicide rises for every other racial group in our nation, including over 50% of Black teenage boys' deaths in this country. And to put that another way, at the height of a global health pandemic, a once-in-a-century pandemic that kept us locked in our homes for our safety, the parents of a Black teenage son in this country were as likely to lose their child in a shooting as every other cause of death that would keep a parent up at night combined. These disparities are somewhat smaller, but still very substantial here in California. Our analysis has also documented significant disparities in gun homicide and gun suicide rates, both between and within different communities in California. At a county level, some counties, especially in the Central Valley, have suffered gun homicide rates that are over double, or at least double the statewide average. And many more rural counties, especially in Northern California and the Sierras, have gun suicide rates that are over triple the statewide average. Looking at both fatal and non-fatal outcomes is vital to understanding these impacts too. For every person killed by gunshot wounds in California, between 2 and 3 others survive. They require serious medical attention in the form of hospitalization or emergency medical care, but survive. Of course, that doesn't capture the larger number of people who suffer vicarious trauma, who witness a shooting, who are shot at, or who are shot and don't require urgent, serious medical attention. But for every person killed by gunshot wounds in California, between 2 and 3 others require serious medical attention and survive. Due to their unique and extreme lethality, their uniquely extreme lethality, suicides are a slight plurality of gun deaths in the state. But life-threatening gun assault injuries are much more common overall. Nearly 3/4 of our gun assault victims survive, many with life-altering impacts and traumas. Most are low income. 3/4 of hospitalized gun assault survivors in California receive health insurance through our state's Medicaid program, and the vast majority, over 85%, are publicly insured or uninsured. This has important implications for the role our public health and mental health systems play in providing tailored trauma recovery and support services for shooting survivors in their care. And this is especially vital for preventing gun violence because many of survivors are also at extremely elevated risk of being shot again and killed. A leading statewide study in California found that compared to the statewide average, the gun homicide rate was over 60 times higher for people who had previously survived one non-fatal shooting. A study at a trauma center in Oakland found that for gun assault patients who survived a shooting and then were discharged from that trauma center, but then died within 5 years after leaving the hospital, gun homicide, a subsequent shooting, was the cause of death for 4 out of 5. Our health systems and the miracles of modern medicine can help stabilize and repair physical wounds, but then too often send our survivors right back into the community and the precarious circumstances where they were shot in the first place, with untreated trauma, and where in a majority of cases nationwide, as was mentioned, we know the vast majority of people who tried to shoot them will remain at large, will not be arrested for that crime. There are effective strategies, as you've heard, for intervention, prevention, and aftercare to help assertively engage gun assault patients and others at highest risk, with a range of supports that promote safety, trauma recovery, and desistance from violence. These may include targeted peer support and mentorship from people with similar experiences, as credible messengers, conflict mediation, cognitive behavioral therapy, trauma counseling, system navigation, including relocation assistance away from a dangerous circumstance. These strategies often fall under the umbrella term community violence intervention. They rely again on authentic messengers with shared lived experience who can break through and engage a population that has often been violently traumatized and alienated from other supports, from criminal justice, health, mental health, victim service, and other supports. They're primarily focused on breaking cycles of violent injury, trauma, and retaliation by engaging and protecting the relatively small number of people at highest risk today and tomorrow, in the near future, the people closest to the pain and violence. And that's essential because, again, as you've heard, researchers have shown that at least half our city's homicides and shootings are committed by a fraction of 1% of the population, even in neighborhoods with the highest rates of violence. A 2019 report estimated that just 3% of people seriously violently injured by community or gang violence in the state received those evidence-based violence intervention services, 3%. In recent years, though, since that study in 2019, California has made really important, vital new investments to help expand and scale up and sustain these violence intervention programs, especially through the California Violence Intervention and Prevention, or CalVIP, grant program, which was launched as a small $9 million per year pilot program for the state in 2017, codified with some new funding through the Break the Cycle of Violence Act in 2019. And most of the funds ever awarded through CalVIP, I think it's fair to say most of the funds ever invested at the state level in community-based violence intervention programs went out just last year in 2 rounds of grant funding through the CalVIP grant program, over $200 million. This year, California enacted legislation to permanently extend that program, opening it up to counties and county agencies for the first time, and removing some other barriers to access as this program transitions from a pilot program to a permanent, sustained feature of our health and safety infrastructure. More public and community-based programs can and should apply for and take advantage of that opportunity. This year, the governor also signed important legislation, AB 28, which will permanently fund CalVIP grants out of a newly established gun violence prevention and school safety fund starting in late 2025. That new special fund will also, upon appropriation by the legislature, invest tens of millions of dollars in new funding for behavioral and mental health services to prevent gun violence, including up to $50 million annually through the Department of Education for school-based behavioral and mental health services and safety improvements designed to prevent gun violence. This bill, among other things, includes $2.5 million annually for the Office of Emergency Services to provide counseling and trauma-informed support services to both direct and secondary victims of shootings and to individuals who have experienced chronic exposure to community gun violence. These investments will not be available until late 2025 at the earliest, but will provide critical and ongoing opportunities and some planning and implementation opportunities and responsibilities as California prepares to invest an estimated $1.5 billion over a decade in comprehensively expanding gun violence intervention, mental health care, and trauma recovery for survivors. At the federal level, too, we've seen changes in many ways, I think, influenced and modeled after California's developments. The Biden administration and Congress have established a federal grant program, especially the Community Violence Intervention and Prevention Initiative, to support this work. We're hoping to see more California communities and agencies develop plans to apply for those competitive grants. Beyond temporary grant opportunities, it's also vital to create more permanent processes for health and mental health systems to cover and reimburse the provision of violence prevention and intervention services, and to reduce, to the extent possible, any administrative barriers to access and sustaining that work. Importantly, last year, California became one of the first states to pass legislation creating a pathway for Medicaid coverage for violence prevention counseling and support services for people who have been victims of community violence, chronically exposed to community violence, or who are otherwise identified by qualified healthcare providers as high risk for violent injury. This new benefit will be rolled out as a component of California's broader new community health worker preventive services effort. It's the piece of legislation Janiesha mentioned the Teens on Target program was so effective in advocating for. Efforts to similarly leverage state and local mental health systems to integrate community violence prevention and intervention may also be vital to expand the number of survivors who receive these life-saving services, especially with coordination and support from local offices of neighborhood safety, violence prevention, that can play a really critical role in coordinating, understanding, and implementing this work. It's a pleasure to be here, and it'll just close with an emphasis on implementation. We have some great new tools here in the toolkit in California. Many are in the process of being rolled out. And as I said at the beginning, transitioning from pilot programs to permanent features. That's difficult work. It's often unglamorous. There aren't headlines written about the shooting that didn't happen because paperwork, red tape barriers were addressed, but it makes a difference. It makes an enormous difference. And people are alive today because of the vital work, especially my panelists have done. Everything we can do to support that kind of work, expand it, scale it up, and build it into as a default measure. Survivors of violence, people at highest risk of being shot today and tomorrow receive these services, is really critical to addressing the mental health impacts of gun violence in California. Thank you.
Despite a grim topic, fantastic. Thank you so much for once more underscoring the need for accessible resources for all of us. I really want to highlight from what you talked about, you humanized data. You turned it into digestible information that we can understand. And I also really appreciate that you crunched the numbers for us. It's one thing to talk about the need for resources, the need for accessibility, but what does it actually look like? What does that actually cost? How are taxpayers, how are citizens of this state actually going to see this? So thank you so much for crunching the numbers for us. Okay, last but not least, I am happy to introduce our last panelist. Please forgive me, I am referencing my phone. I'm not texting. And of course, now I'm having a delay in my phone.
I can help you out if you'd like, if you want.
Do you have a copy of yours?
Oh, I know who I am. I can
Oh.
introduce myself.
Ladies and gentlemen, take it away. Dr. Nguyen.
So I'm Rita Nguyen. I am the Assistant Health Officer at the California Department of Public Health. I oversee what we call our pillar of population health. That includes our Center for Family Health. It includes the Maternal Child Adolescent Health and WIC. It also includes the Center for Environmental Health, the Center for Health Statistics and Informatics, and our Center for Healthy Communities, which houses our injury and violence prevention branch, where a lot of this work is housed. I have the honor of getting to oversee about a third of our department. And prior to that, I was at the San Francisco Department of Public Health, also the Assistant Health Officer. My focus there was chronic disease prevention. I am an internal medicine physician by training, but my heart and passions have always been in community health and public health, and that's what brings me here today. I just wanted to start off by saying just how humbled I am to get to hear from everyone's personal and professional experiences, and I just really want to thank you in particular to Ms. Grisham and to Director Vaughn about sharing what brings you to this space and what's been inspiring to you. I feel like for my colleague, Ari and I working at the state, it's really our job to really honor what it is that you all have lived through and your work professionally and personally, and to think about how we can use state resources to really pay tribute to what is going on in our communities and what we can do better. So I just want to thank you for sharing your space and time with me. So to start off, I wanted to introduce a little bit about CDPH. Oh, I'm going to grab this. Thank you. Okay, so at the California Department of Public Health, our mission is to advance the health and well-being of California's diverse people and communities. Our vision, therefore, is one of healthy communities with thriving families and individuals. Our core values are collaboration, competence, equity, integrity, respect, responsibility, trust, and vision. Folks sometimes ask, is gun violence a public health problem? And it resoundingly is. I hope that you've gotten a sense through the other speakers and certainly through Dr. Kravitz-Wirtz framing that gun violence is a public health problem, not just in terms of the toll it takes on death and injury. We also just
heard from Ari about the immediate impacts of the acute injury, chronic disability that comes thereafter, but also the impact on trauma and behavioral health of those that are immediately affected, but also the community that's affected by this trauma. It ultimately causes barriers to improve health and well-being. So gun violence actually is what we call a social determinant of health, in the same way that economic opportunity, education, transportation, housing, food security are social determinants of health. Gun violence, the exposure to it, are determinants of health and can inhibit folks, community members' ability to achieve optimal health. One study estimated that childhood exposure to crime, including gun violence, actually accounted for costs in terms of healthcare, life productivity, criminal involvement, and educational outcomes that were estimated to be at over $450 billion in costs. And we heard a lot about this a little bit earlier about the historic increases in firearm violence. So I'll skip through it pretty quickly, in that we have seen declines, but in recent years with the pandemic, there have been increases, both in homicides and suicides in California. And as we've heard time and time again, as is the case with so many health issues, equity and justice is core to our efforts. We are seeing persistent inequities across race and ethnicity, which are ultimately outcomes that we see built by the structural inequities that we built in our societies in terms of concentrating poverty, practices such as redlining that under-resources certain communities, ensures that the educational systems in those communities aren't really optimizing community members for success and upward mobility. We see that, again, the homicide rate for Black populations is almost 15 times higher than other groups. And issues of equity are really at the center of how public health approaches many health issues. And we also saw with the pandemic that a lot of this exacerbated the conditions that we knew were already setting folks up for worse outcomes. And the same drivers of poverty, unemployment, and also just the lack of social connectedness, as you've heard previously. We had breakdowns in these everyday life patterns, people who are accessing social support networks through schools or through their CBOs or through church were pretty abruptly closed off from those things. And it's taken a while, and we're still in a recovery phase from all of these sort of losses in the pandemic. And so I want to take a moment to even describe what it is we mean when we say a public health approach to gun violence. A lot of folks understandably confuse public health for health care, but public health really is the approach to how we build our societies to support entire populations for optimal health and opportunity. And earlier on, Dr. Kravitz-Wirtz had introduced the socio-ecological model. You didn't catch it, but my public health brain saw it. It's these overlapping circles of like, it's not just about the individual and telling the individual, don't smoke, eat well, exercise, don't partake in violence. It's about everything else around that individual, the social structures, the neighborhoods, the faith-based organizations. And then you go further from that and you think about what educational systems, what job opportunities are possible for this individual. Are there vacant lots? Are there safe places to play? And then you go back even further to that and you're talking about government policy and how we've structured neighborhoods to have unjust resources. And so when we think about a public health to gun violence, we see it similarly. It's not just about the individual who may have partaken in a violent act or owned a gun. It's how did we enable that person to get to a point where they have access to the guns, but also don't feel any sense of hope or upward mobility. And I just really loved Director Vaughn's example of like taking youth out to see the world, that it is so much more than their existence in the bubble in the middle, and that it is incumbent upon all of us to support societies that really support individuals. I also think about a reverend in East LA by the name of Gregory Boyle. Yes. From East LA. And he says, nothing stops a bullet like a job. And that really does speak to how job opportunity and like economic mobility is at the root of a lot of this. And so I really appreciate your example of the stipends for the fellows. And so public health looks at all of this and thinks about how do we actually prevent violence from happening? How do we build more successful communities? How do we think, and we call it upstream. So before violence even happens, how do we set up these families? Their approaches tend to be community driven as well. And it is addressing root causes of violence. A big piece of this is also being data driven. So you've heard time and time again today about evidence-based solutions. And so we also look to the science and look to what is effective. And it was great to see Dr. Kravitz-Wirtz highlight some of the research around how income supplements and housing actually decrease violence. And so these are the things that we're interested in looking at so that we can prevent the violence. And then there's also secondary and tertiary. So akin to what Ms. Grisham had said about after violence happens, then you have to intervene and support those victims of violence so that secondary violence doesn't happen. And that's what we talk about in terms of secondary and tertiary prevention. How do we prevent it after it's happened once? And what are the measures that can prevent further harm and death? And so some considerations for gun violence prevention strategies. What we know is that the most consistent and powerful predictor of violence is a prior history of violent behavior. We also know from literature that substance use, as well as child abuse and adult environment also contribute to gun violence. And so we recognize that through research, how do we strategically invest in areas that are known to be effective? We also recognize that it requires an increased investment in children, youth, families, and communities. The other perspective that public health often takes is a life course perspective, that the young adult that we see now, or the adult that's affected by gun violence or inflicting gun violence, they were once babies, they were once children living in these communities. And how did we optimize them for success and instill tools around resilience that actually supports them as they approach adulthood? And so recognizing that a lot of the health issues we deal with around public health, like in old age and chronic disease, this all started when children were in their womb and in their mothers, and what stress and violence was occurring to the mother that then contributed to the increased risk for various health outcomes. We also focus our resources on communities and individuals with the risk factors. And sort of what I was saying earlier about ensuring that folks have things like economic security and mobility, as well as resilience and educational opportunities. And then naming the gender norms and gender gaps we see in violence and how that can contribute to intimate partner violence. So really changing the norms around masculinity in our society and how that can contribute to aggression and violence in young boys and men. Looking to three major bodies in public health, I just wanted to give a overview of, so the Association of State and Territorial Health Officers, ASTHO, they represent the health officers and public health agencies across the country. The middle one is about Safe States Alliance, which is a nonprofit who also works on a variety of policies related to safety. And then the Prevention Institute, which is also a nonprofit that's working to improve community health and well-being through a focus on prevention. And so the three of these entities actually put forward policy statements of their approach to gun violence prevention. And what was great to see is there are a lot of commonalities, one of which is that we really should promote firearm-related injuries as a public health issue. It's not just an individual problem to be solved or a healthcare issue to be solved, but really thinking about supportive environments and societies that promote health and safety. Secondly is thinking about policies that promote safe and storage of firearms. So we do know that in homes that have firearms, the chances of a firearm injury or death is actually twice as high for any household that has a gun. And so thinking about policies that promote that safe storage. So part of it is like education and providing people with lock boxes and that sort of thing. And then another common thread through these three policy recommendations is the importance of public health surveillance systems. So Ari and others showed great data on how are we doing with violent deaths related to gun violence? Are there improvements? Where is it a heightened issue? And what are the factors that might be contributing to it? A lot of what public health does is having visibility on what's actually happening with various health issues like gun violence. And then the other piece is ensuring that we have enough research that's related to firearm injury and gun violence. We need to know more. It's relatively underfunded when you think about the amount of money that goes into gun violence research relative to chronic disease or cancer. It's on a tenfold difference. And so it's reflected in how we haven't had very laser focused understanding of the drivers of gun violence, and also the most effective strategies to scale at a population level. The last one I wanted to mention was a common theme amongst the three was the need to really promote reducing the risks and increasing resilience among individuals, families, and communities. And so at CDPH, we have a number of efforts related to gun violence prevention. And you can see at the top what I mentioned earlier about public health surveillance. So we do run the California Violent Death Reporting System, CalVDRS, which is a way for most of our public health departments in the state to report violent deaths. So we're able to see where is this occurring by race, ethnicity, by age, what is the method of death. We also have a number of other surveillance systems like Epicenter, which is also one that tracks public health data. What we will be announcing later on this year and the early of next year is CalVDRS will have suicide dashboard and a homicide dashboard, and that'll enable people to actually manipulate the data and understand it throughout the state. 34 counties and cities or local health departments, both county and city, partake in CalVDRS. Our goal is always to have that give a more complete picture of California as we grow our surveillance system. Another bucket of area we work on is safe storage, which I mentioned a little bit earlier. And you can sort of see the buckets on the left around research and evaluations, and then policies to improve safety practices and resilience, as well as ensuring that we have systems in place and infrastructure that supports violence prevention. And I'll talk about that last piece, the Violence Prevention Initiative, which is our department-wide effort to address violence prevention across our department, whether you're in the violence prevention branch or in maternal, child, adolescent health, or in our Office of Health Equity. We just recently launched what we're calling our policy roadmap for violence prevention. This is funded by the CDC. And the hope of the production of this roadmap is to provide a resource to educate and inform California state and local decision makers about effective and promising gun violence policies and strategies that can support improvements in gun and other forms of violence. So we will be engaging with a lot of you all, probably on the commission and others, in both qualitative and quantitative research to help inform this roadmap. And these are the components of what we're going to embark in the next year. So part of that is the literature review and policy landscape. What do we know as a nation and even as a globe of what is effective in other countries relative to what's happening in California? Thinking about the state agency landscape. So in government, what is the Department of Healthcare Services doing, the Department of Justice, but also the commission, how you all might contribute to our vision of this roadmap of where we could go as a state. Serving our local health departments, ensuring we're speaking to key informant interviews and experts in the field. And those experts include community listening sessions. So most importantly, hearing from those affected by violence about what they see as the opportunity here for our public health approach to gun violence. And so in terms of our successes and challenges, we're happy to report this launching of the roadmap that by a year's time, we really would love to have a stake in the ground of California's public health approach to gun violence and what we are finding to be the most effective countermeasures. We are always happy with a continued and ongoing new partnerships, certainly with Ari's group at the Office of Gun Violence and Prevention. And then as in terms of challenges, in order for us to have great visibility and really study where we could really focus our efforts, having better data from our counties that are reporting violence death would create a more comprehensive system of surveillance. And always working to break down silos. We all know that we're in this for the right reasons and at the same time are so hyper-focused sometimes on implementing our programs that we don't recognize there's real opportunity to collaborate and synergize, particularly around behavioral health. which leads me to this is that, we in public health and increasingly amongst our behavioral health partners are seeing this shift from individual, collective, population-based, a shift from individual focus to really thinking upstream and those wider bubbles outside the individual in terms of how do we create better societies and systems that promote health. Really recognizing that trauma is a risk factor, and it's not just about that individual, but all the vicarious trauma in that immediate family and the neighborhood that's affected by gun violence. And then finally, addressing these complex problems that share multiple risk and protective factors. And they're very interrelated in terms of violence and adverse childhood events. And thinking about, again, the life course perspective, how do we intervene amongst pregnant women and infants and children who are exposed to adverse events and violence. And with that, I'm going to end with some references to our website, the Violence Prevention Initiative. I'm happy to be here and thank you for really elevating this issue of gun violence as both a mental behavioral health issue and a public health issue.
My first thought as a therapist, when Dr. Nguyen, you said, I know myself, my inner therapist was like, yes, she does. Wonderful to hear. I want to, if I could please get the clicker.
Oh, yes.
I'm going to close out with another guided mindfulness exercise, and then also just highlighting resources. Thank you so much. So just first off, as we've been discussing here this whole time, this firearm violence and as a part of mass violence is both a private and a public matter. It impacts individuals and it also impacts us on group scales, particularly marginalized groups on the downside of power and privilege. And starting with the individual nature of the impacts of firearm violence, the two leading individual coping skills for this, just to reiterate, is behavior activation or simply just moving your body with some sort of purpose. That could be playing some music and dancing. That could be walking around your block, assuming it's a safe environment to do so, and things of that sort. Following up with that, there's mindfulness-based stress reduction or other meditative practices. And so far, these two individual coping skills have been modeled here by our panelists. We have people moving their body with a purpose, doing advocacy. We have people taking time out of their lives to use their own personal experiences and hold space for others. So that's where we lead into the the group scale level of coping. So first and foremost, seeking psychosocial support. So seeking support from others, seeking just warm spaces that can contain you and be there for you. Once a person is more even-keeled and able to once a person is more even-keeled, then that's an opportunity to be that resource, to be that help that other people may need. So again, from an individual level, just moving our body and clearing our mind as best we can. At a group scale, it's seeking those resources, seeking those services, cultivating that social support. And then also, again, once we're even keeled, once we're able to stand on our own 2 feet psychologically, being that resource, providing that source for others, being part of that group that gets cultivated. And we've seen that demonstrated through the panelists here. We have many people in the trenches, metaphorically, providing that support, doing the research, creating the statistics, and then sharing that, disseminating that with others. So this is really hopeful to just sit on this panel. I'm very honored to sit on this panel because this is a glimmer of hope in this mass-wide public health concern and individual crisis and that we're all experiencing inevitably. So I just want to be brief and show some of the resources that we have available. These are all available on my slides, which I believe are available to everyone. So first off, if people on the theme of being prepared, not paranoid, prepared for the unlikely event, which is all too likely these days, of being caught in mass violence, particularly a mass shooting, here is a worksheet that my research team has devised. There's a little QR code you can scan and a little code for a free download for this. This is a free resource for anyone. And it helps us develop that violence budget, and it helps us also just know what to do behaviorally, what to do if one is caught in a mass violent event. I'm also just gonna breeze a bit through these. These are other resources such as the APA's statement on mass violence, tips and tools. We have resources on how to talk to young ones about school shootings, which they're at risk for, unfortunately. We have some organizations that have become that social support space, such as the Sandy Hook Promise. We also have like the Rebels Project, which came as a result of Columbine in 1999. We have resources from SAMHSA on just addressing incidents of mass violence, helping define it. Then again, more resources on talking to the young ones. So talking to children about violence, tips for parents and teachers. And just moving on. And then also directly from the source, the U.S. Secret Service's National Threat Assessment Centers Mass Attacks in Public Spaces. That's an excellent publication. It's a free download. I believe it's like 74 pages. It helps illustrate what to look out for, being a mindful citizen, just knowing what a potentially violent person, how they may behave, and what they may be doing in your community. So on that all said, I also want to highlight part of that violence diet, that violence budget. I want to give credit to the Movement for Black Lives for their social media accounts. They have, what's in front of you is an excellent guide on how to filter your online consumption of violent content. Most social media applications have a way where you can block certain words or have certain themes not presented in your feed. So that's an excellent resource right there. And ultimately, so let's meditate out of this. That's how I always say it with my sessions. So again, if your body allows, please feel free to join us. You don't have to. Feel free to place both feet on the ground, and your hands can do anything but be in a fist. Okay. If you feel so comfortable, you can close your eyes. And again, if you want to keep your eyes open, just look at something that's staying still. So one more time, let's take a nice deep breath in through our nose. And this time, just sigh it out. 3 more times. Breathe in nice and full. And just sigh it out. Again, breathe in nice and full. Expand your whole body. And sigh it out when you're ready. Last time here, biggest breath of your day. And nice audible exhale out. And keeping your eyes closed if they are. Again, just notice your breathing for what it is. Notice if it's shallow or maybe a bit deeper right now. And I invite you to direct your attention to your body at large. Still breathing as you have been this whole time. Notice what your body is responding to this conversation on firearm violence and its impacts. Notice if within your body there's any tension, tightness, possibly comfort. Just notice what's within your body. If you become distracted by any thoughts, this is normal. This is your brain doing its job. Just forgive yourself and gently redirect your attention to your body at large. Notice what your posture says about you right now. Notice how your mood is impacted by this and vice versa. Notice if there's any tightness in your jaw, tightness in your brow. Notice if you're clenching anywhere. Or perhaps notice if you feel any ease or comfort. Notice if understanding and hearing about these resources and skills may actually give you a sense of comfort. And again, just noticing how our body feels right here, right now, in this very moment. As if it's the most important thing on the universe right now. Notice how your body feels right here and right now. And as we gently come back, again, bring some gentle movement into your body. Maybe reposition yourself, roll your shoulders or your neck, wiggle your toes or your fingers. And once you feel comfortable, open your eyes and come back. Okay, so right there, hopefully that modeled one of the simplest tools and skills we can do to cope with this, both on an individual and on a group scale, this phenomena of firearm violence. And with that, I want to thank my fellow panelists. I want to thank everyone here for attendance. Thank you for inviting all of us for this. And again, thank you for anyone who is currently streaming this. It's all very much appreciated on both ends. Thank you for allowing us to be a resource for you, applying to those skills, and thank you for receiving the mentorship and the skills and the space we're attempting to hold for you all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Espinoza, for facilitating this wonderful panel. For all the speakers, thank you for sharing your knowledge and expertise with us. I want to open it up for any questions, comments from my fellow commissioners at this time. Please, Commissioner Mitchell.
Good afternoon, and thank you for that wonderful presentation, just loaded with really good information. I am curious, Dr. Nguyen and Mr. Freilich, given the Office of Public Health and DOJ, I am curious how the two of you will work together or that collaboration when we speak of gun violence in populations where it's mostly African Americans, and again, that maybe 1 or 2% that's causing the most harm, but those numbers are staggering. I am curious, how do you work together to build interventions that have trust in them for that community? Because when I listened to Mr. Vaughn's program, excellent program, but again, they are on the ground in the community, building trust, and have made amazing strides. And so how do you do that when there's that law enforcement component? Because that trust has to be built when we're targeting where these real problems exist. So I'm just curious, how are there conversations about that, or how do we make that really effective?
Appreciate the question. I'll start, and so I'll start by saying the state's investment in this work has actually largely come through the grant program I referenced is through the Board of State and Community Corrections. My office was recently, through legislation, placed in the executive steering committee of that grant program, but largely the state's role to date has been through competitive grants that provide funding to actually allow local city-led public agencies and community-based organizations tap into those funds and hire personnel to do the work, to do the vital work. I've seen the role of my new office, a very small team, of trying to be a voice to uplift the need for those kind of supports, to try to be a voice for using data to spotlight gaps in best practices, and be a voice for a liaison with those folks who are doing this vital work in their communities to understand what barriers to success they're facing. And so some of that, I think, has been shown up in legislation that was passed this year, for instance, to try to reduce some of the administrative barriers that those community groups identified, that those local agencies identified, ranging from low caps on funding to match requirements, for instance, that had required that any agency or wanting to qualify for state funds to do violence prevention work had to provide a one-to-one match in terms of the funding. I think there were some plausible or well-intentioned reasons for that as the pilot program was created, but it also kept some organizations without a longer track record and foundation of financial resources from being able to tap into those resources and expand. I think one of the things I'm trying to do in this position for 5 months is also work closely with the Department of Public Health, with other agencies that either currently or will soon, because of new legislation, receive new funding in this space. So reaching out to break through silos, connect with, for instance, the Department of Education that will be rolling out $50 million annually to expand school-based mental health services. We are definitely not the only offices in the state dedicated. We know that have roles dedicated to violence prevention. I think what's important at every level is that we have more people whose job it is to think about implementation, to think about barriers to success and access, and to be essentially advocates for those in their community doing the work. Sometimes, often, at least to date, the first step that we've heard is funding. These programs have been chronically underinvested in, undervalued, underpaid to do dangerous and difficult work that is vital, as you've heard, to reduce violence. And so that funding alone doesn't solve all problems, but it has been a necessary step. I think the state is starting to transition to more permanent funding solutions. I think that there's much more needed there. And so that's my long way of answering your question, I think, is to say that there are a few different mechanisms. Our office is not a grant maker at this point for community-based violence intervention programs. The legislation I addressed does provide some funding for DOJ to provide late 2025 to support technical assistance provision, some law enforcement related work to, for instance, address the moral crisis that I believe less than 20% of shootings in this country lead to an arrest. That does have implications for, as was discussed, the cycle of violence and retaliation. So there is a law enforcement component. I think there's an appropriate focus on ways we can also leverage the full spectrum of responses, public health-based, proactive, preventative responses too.
Yeah, I'll just add to that. I think that's such a great question because when in public health, our approach to any issue is one of partnership, because inherently, if we're thinking about the world within these wider overlapping circles, we can't achieve health equity by ourselves. And we often talk about the bigger picture of public health is all of this. It's housing, it's transportation, it's the Department of Justice, and we walk the walk. And so when Ari first started his job, we were eager to meet him, and I know our team was stalking you for a while. So so much of what we do is partnership, and part of that is elevating our perspective from a public health approach of how do you approach individuals collectively. And it's interesting that you mentioned trust, because one of the major messages that our director has been pushing out for us as a department is the importance of trust and what are the components of trust. And part of it is showing up consistently, showing that our community members that we care, that we're confident, that we can deliver, that even just relying on those who do have trust and building trust amongst those. So trust is actually a very explicit priority and value for our department. It's embedded in the way that we build partnerships to then affect the things that we don't have direct control over, but ultimately do drive health outcomes. And part of that is partnerships with the Department of Justice, with folks and leaders like Ari. And so we've been really happy with our ongoing conversations with Ari. And I know my team has met several times to talk about what is the public health approach to gun violence and how might we find tangible ways to synergize our efforts.
Thank you both for your responses. Ari, I am curious. The numbers that were brought down so dramatically because of the work that was done in Richmond, did that impact the state's overall numbers? I'm just curious if you would know that or have that data. But I do realize that they've gone back up since COVID. But that just seems like that work should be modeled somewhere.
The short answer is yes. I think when I said 2019 was our lowest gun death rate on record, I think we saw, communities like Richmond played an important role in that kind of work. It was a model for work launched elsewhere too. I think it's fair to say that you were a model for many other cities. Learn from your successes, and also for the state's investment. I know from my previous work in the advocacy space, when we were saying we want to invest, we need as a state, our top priority for saving lives from gun violence is to invest in this kind of work. We were looking for where, the examples of where it had been working. And I think Richmond was often, Richmond at the time, Oakland had seen about 50% cuts in about 6 years or so after implementing some new programs, and often led by the work of Youthful Alive, other community-based support. So that's, again, my long way of answering your question. The short answer is yes. I think really helped California achieve that record low gun death rate in 2019 is a big piece of how we can get back there.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Commissioner Bunch, please.
I had a comment and a question. My comment is, given everything we've heard today and the really specific recommendation to focus resources on communities and individuals with the risk factors. I still am really disappointed that we haven't figured out a way to invest in the REACH program. We've all heard about it multiple times. We've walked the streets with them. We know they're getting the work done in the way that's been suggested, but we still haven't figured out a way to actually invest in a program that we know is doing the work. So that was my comment. My question was for Dr. Wirtz. One of your slides said that we're seeing an increase in firearm acquisition since 2020. Is there any research on why we're seeing the increase in the acquisition of firearms?
Yeah, so we here in California did a survey. We have an ongoing survey research project on firearm ownership and exposure to violence and its consequences. It's a representative survey across the state. And we were doing one, COVID happened. And so we retooled that instrument to sort of ask questions specifically about reasons for purchasing a firearm, acquiring a firearm in response to the pandemic. And one of the things we saw potentially reflective of just broader themes of that time was that individuals were saying they, felt a lot of fear and anxiety and uncertainty about the future, and that guns provided, I think, given some of our larger social norms, some sense of security, which is counter to what we know from the evidence, right? Is that you bring a firearm into the home and it increases risk of death and injury for everyone in the home, particularly unintentional shootings and firearm suicide. But again, some of the broader themes that we saw come from that survey and that I think are reflected in some of the increases in firearm sales were that people were also more and more disconnected from some of the fundamental, foundational systems of support and the institutions that build up communities and families. They were disconnected from those through the pandemic. And again, firearms, became sort of a tangible sort of thing to turn to. And yet, we know that sense of safety and security counters what we know from the evidence in terms of violence prevention and injury prevention.
Commissioner Brown.
Thank you. As you all spoke, and I appreciate you very much being here. It really drives home the notion that this problem is multifaceted, it is longstanding, it's complex, it's difficult, and like any problem with those origins, it will not be solved quickly or easily or inexpensively. And we're so wired as Americans that we want instant fixes to things. And for many years, I think there has been in many ways, a singular pursuit of how we address gun violence is by controlling guns, the guns themselves, rather than addressing what really you are all addressing in one way or another, and that is the mentality behind it. And as a previous panelist that we had here before, Cuco Rodriguez, said very eloquently, you could take all the guns away from everyone, but really the underlying problem is the mentality that for some people you think that it's okay for you to take a life because somebody disagrees with you or you have a problem with another person. And so focusing on that understanding, it also really is apparent as I look at all of the prevention suggestions and programs that you have and what they do, that in many respects, they're equally applicable to other very serious problems in our communities, particularly the fentanyl epidemic is what really strikes me. And again, an epidemic that's taking lives at a disastrous rate in our communities. Other drug problems, that have are having a lethal impact on our communities and our state and our nation. So, and identifying things that you have identified, investing in children and youth and families and communities, housing, education, and increasing resilience, all of these things are equally applicable to that problem as well. And so I think we need to take a fresh look at, we can get a 2-for-1 or a 3-for-1 or a 5-for-1 approach to solving our problems in our community if we adopt some of these strategies. And the priorities of local government, frankly, have not always been in investing in people. They have been, geared towards, electric cars and global warming and other things. I mean, investments perhaps in the long term for people, but not in the short term, not in what can be done to address and save lives. And in the private sector and the philanthropic community, same way. It's probably far easier to go out and get money to build an opera house than it's going to be to get money to provide programs in Oakland and Richmond and other places in our state that are in desperate need of them. But I do salute all of you, I think, and I thank you for the work that you're doing, and I think that it's tremendous. I do have a question for Sam and for Janiesha. My question is, how does law enforcement partner with you in your communities with this program, if they do, and if so, and if they don't, or if there could be improvement in that, what could be done to better have the participation of law enforcement, whether it be through referrals or direct involvement of some kind, or part of the mentoring program? Do you have any examples of that, or have you had any problems or issues with that?
So your question ultimately was, what can law enforcement do for us, or what have you done for us? Sorry.
I guess the first question is, do you have any kind of partnership with local law enforcement in Oakland and in Richmond with these programs? And if not, why not? And what do you think could be done to develop that partnership? Because as I see it, the people that you're serving, the people that are part of your program, are going to be involved with law enforcement. There are ways, I would think, to be able to partner with law enforcement even if it was just for, referring people that are maybe before they get to the point where they're pulling the trigger on people out in the community.
Dang, what should I let you go first? I feel like that aspect is not for my part of the job. I think our VIs and people who are actually on the ground after homicides, I believe they have a relationship with law enforcement, and that's how we get that information to even go out to mediate and solve these conflicts. Please don't quote me on this, but I believe that is it. But for me and my program, specifically for the youth, we don't really have any, we don't really, what is the word I'm looking for? Yeah, we don't really collaborate. That's the word I was looking for, with law enforcement. And I think that would be nice for you to see, like, you guys in our spaces. Like, that's what I meant by creating these safe spaces where law enforcement, government officials, and everybody can just come sit and talk to us. So I think it really is as simple as that. But as far as our relationship with law enforcement, I can't really speak too much on it from Youth Alive's perspective, because I am not in that department per se. But so I'm concerned we do have one for our boots on the ground people, but I think for Teens on Target and like our youth-led programs, we definitely could use more collaboration with you guys, because we need y'all. You need to hear what we have to say. So I think it just starts there. I hope that answered your question.
For our population, law enforcement is the enemy. Yes, that's the way it is. So, and once again, we have to accept them for who they are. We have to go to where they are, and to be able to build that trust, we have to have a complete wall between us. It's just the only way that we can do gun violence intervention.
I understand that, but I also think that probably builds a wall of distrust between you and the police as well.
Yeah.
Which
I've been to jail doing my work.
which I think is, it's, you
Yeah,
know,
that's
it's
unfair. but-
understandable in some ways, but, and maybe problematic in the long term. So, yeah, as I said, I don't know if, and if it's, your program is pretty unique. Yours is a little different in terms of you're dealing with people that are, before they get to the point where they're involved in shootings and murders and what have you. So I would think that it's especially important to try to, you know, because there are a lot of law enforcement programs that are involving, you know, a connection with youth and that are involved in mentorship and police activities leagues and, you know, a variety of different community-based programs that I think would dovetail very nicely with what you're doing. And even if it's not direct involvement, I think law enforcement for your population, if they're aware that you're working with somebody, if they're aware that you're working, you know, there might be an opportunity for them to have a little more understanding if they come across that person. And, you know, perhaps, and they have the discretion of whether or not to arrest that person or not. You know, and it could, if there was a little bit more understanding, perhaps, you know, stop an arrest from being made, stop a charge from being filed, stop, you know, somebody going down that track as well. And I realize we're talking in the abstract here, and it's complicated, but I'm just telling you how it strikes me. So.
It was brought up, I can't see the placard right now, but Commissioner over there brought up the theme of mistrust. And yeah, why wouldn't one community have mistrust? We have to acknowledge too, I don't believe it was stated, but firearm homicide includes perpetrators that are in law enforcement. So all sides, civilians and law enforcement agents, all in the United States commit homicide violence and that's redundant, commit firearm related homicide. And I think that's why I really appreciate that the need to develop trust is required with this. My next comment is a genuine question. If anyone can answer this, I would love to hear it. I've heard of programs like Coffee with a Cop and things of that sort, where the attempt is to familiarize law enforcement agents with members of the community they're sworn to protect and serve. You're less likely to shoot someone if you see them as a human through these engagement. My question is it's a genuine question. Is there research that shows that these events like help reduce firearm related homicide perpetrated by law enforcement agents? Like, do these help? Do these community engagement, this communication facilitation, does it actually help?
I don't know of any studies that show that it helps, but I think it's intuitively it will help build relationships and build trust, which in turn can provide mutual understanding that can also result in a community that's better equipped to take care of its own. And maybe, you know, I mean, I'm the sheriff in Santa Barbara County. We don't have the same problems and issues that you do in Oakland and in Richmond with street violence and with youth that feel so disillusioned and frankly, we don't have the mistrust. Our public doesn't mistrust us the way that in some minority communities in particular, you know, it happens. And I worked in a minority community. I worked in the city of Inglewood for 12 and a half years in Los Angeles County. And, you know, so I'm familiar with both sides of that. But even in your police agencies, I dare to say that there are officers who are known to some of your clientele and your population that do have a reputation of being fair and treating them the right way and so forth. And I suspect that you know, that's the case. Maybe that's where you start to build on things. But I also I just want to clarify with you, Dr. Espinoza, that, you know, equating, you know, homicides are committed by police in certain instances. In 99.9% of the times, those are justifiable homicides. And you can't equate justifiable homicides with criminal homicides the way any more than you could, William F. Buckley once said to somebody that he was debating on the topic, he said to say that is the case is to say that somebody pushes an elderly lady out of into the path of an oncoming train, and somebody that pushes a lady out of the path of an oncoming train are just two people that are pushing old ladies around. It's a very, very distinct difference.
If you don't, can I just add? So I think, we know from research, right, that police killings are extremely disproportionate. They're overrepresented in Black and Brown communities. And we know from research again that the communities most affected by violence, by firearm violence, are just chronically over-surveilled and underserved by law enforcement agencies. And so where we've seen, at least from my perspective and my reading of the literature, is that where we've seen the most success in community-oriented and community-based violence intervention is when the flow of information is one directional. So the flow of information does not go from communities to police. When there is collaboration, it goes from police to community, and community is the one to be taking the lead in addressing the harms that are still happening at disproportionate rates within communities, and that are often by various systems, including law enforcement, but other systems as well. And so I think until we can address some of those systemic harms, we can't expect communities to rely on those systems that have been consistently harming them. And so I think we need to be realistic about that. And that's where we've seen, I think, the most success research-wise as well.
Thank you, Dr. Wirtz.
So thank you. That kind of, gives some answer to my question. So if there are programs that have been found to be effective in promoting that sense of trust within a community from law enforcement in one direction towards the community, this is now me kind of just thinking out loud, but if there was, and I don't know the funding, so Ari, help us out. I don't know our budget, but if for some reason there was a program that helped educate law enforcement agents on these matters, as well as
Microphone. Thank you.
Hi, I can repeat what I'm saying. So I don't know the budget or whatever exists in this capacity. This is me somewhat thinking out loud, but if there was a program that educated law enforcement agents on everything we just discussed, as well as community outreach programs that educated citizens on everything we had just talked about, and then if there was an organization to facilitate communication between those two bodies, which is, law enforcement and the people they're sworn to protect, that communication right there. Communication is the number one factor in promoting trust. Communication, and then as Dr. Nguyen noted, consistency. So saying you're going to do something and then behaviorally actually doing or not doing the thing you agreed to. So I don't know if there's a budget for this, but perhaps this sounds like there are methods that promote trust within a community, which can in turn reduce firearm homicide. So if that could
Madam
exist,
Chair?
that could be facilitated.
So
I just wanted to briefly mention, we spent an entire day in Watts a few months ago, and we saw tremendous cooperation between the sheriff's department and that community, which arguably is ground zero. So, and I'm not in law enforcement, but however that happened there, I know it's possible and it's impressive, and does seem like it should be a piece of the answer here.
yes, thank you, Commissioner Carnevale. Vice Chair Alvarez, I see you. I just wanted to make a comment, and then I will hand it over to you as well. So just something I just wanted to share. We keep talking around the root cause or issue, which is generational poverty and really a lack of fundamental basic needs. And I heard from Sam and Janiesha successful programs, and they address these, right? Not just basic needs, but also the social connection and those kinds of needs. And I hope that as we move forward, we're really intentionally targeting this. So we heard the academia, right? We heard the research, and I'm especially taken by slides 12 and 13 of Dr. Wirtz. Places most affected by firearm violence, also plagued by structural disadvantage. And I think it's important to talk about structural racism as well. I mean, it all goes back to it. And I know we're not going to address that here and now, but we can't leave that out of the conversation because it is directly tied to that. And so I would ask that as we're talking roadmaps and, so many roadmaps and so much surveillance, we need to start doing something about this because it's every day, right? And when we were in Watts, they stopped counting the shootings. It's not even reported. If it happens in San Diego County in my neighborhood or La Jolla, it's counted. They stopped counting. They don't even document it. So surveillance roadmaps, let's implement. So I just wanted to say that. And this commission is happy to work with. Please let us know how we can do that. So Sam, Janiesha, thank you for the work you do. It's changing lives and we're here to support and do anything we can. I'm going to pass it over to Vice Chair Alvarez. I see that hand, so you're up.
Thanks, Chair Madrigal-Weiss. I also just want to extend my deep appreciation to the panel for the discussion today. And I think just the continued questions really highlights just how multifaceted the challenge is and that there is no perfect solution. But what has been centered in the conversation has really been the incredible knowledge and power of communities themselves and how resources in the hands of our communities, whether it be community organizations and churches and trusted partners, that creates the safety and welcoming environments that we need in order to prevent violence. So I really want to applaud our panelists for being here with us. And in particular, I want to give credit to the leadership and commitment of our departments of public health and the Department of Justice, who are working together, and also to this commission, for the staff and leadership of this commission for being open to this conversation and for extending its own resources to support that coordinated strategy. And I hope, the progress that Mr. Freilich shared, that we can continue to see that here in California. As the Attorney General's designee on this commission, I'm really grateful for the open dialogue that's occurred with their office, and now for the opportunity to further strengthen that collaboration with Mr. Freilich's new leadership. I want to pivot a little bit and actually ask a question of Ms. Grisham. I was very moved by your comments, and in particular, what you said about these last couple of years having to learn to do it yourselves, right? In response to isolation, in response to the pandemic. But I think that having to learn to do it yourself was a matter of necessity that I think has been repeated in communities of color and marginalized communities for centuries. And I'm curious your thoughts on what more we can do to invest in the leadership and knowledge of young people to serve in these peer roles in order to create a bridge to supports and services where it may not have existed before. There's been tremendous leadership on behalf of this commission and our agency partners around peer support specialists as adults. But we also know young people are offering those peer supports, young people in middle school and high school to young adults. So I would love your thoughts, Ms. Grisham, on the role of young people as peer support, and in particular, opportunities to further strengthen our investment in their leadership.
I'm not good with answering questions on the spot, but I'm gonna try. First, I think it just starts by realizing in these spaces that our youth are the leaders, because we want to hear from them. We want to know their opinions, their thoughts. Honestly, it's kind of their world right now, so it's best that we just listen to what they say and be able to put them in the spaces to where the people that need to hear them can hear them. I really think that's the biggest aspect of what I was asked. I'm trying to think of the second part of the question. Yeah. What was the second part of the question?
my question was just around the investments in young people, in particular, starting even younger, right? In high school and in middle school, recognizing that peers are such an important model in offering support for mental health and well-being.
I think we also need to show that in our community, because that's one thing we don't do. I'm not gonna say I don't see, but I don't really see a lot of adults even being peers. So how will our youth learn how to be peers in that way? We also know that kids are preparing for prom. They want to buy shoes. They want to do this. They want to do that. So incentives are also needed, like you want to go to this middle school, you want to go teach your younger sibling or somebody who looks like your younger sibling, let me pay you to do that. Let me put some money in your pocket. So you're educating them, but you're also, taking care of yourself at the same time. So I think that's the investment. Like realistically, we can't just ask these kids to go in these rooms and be like, okay, go educate them and that be it, and that's your job, and that's all we have for you. We have to reward them for the work they do, because I think I was telling somebody earlier, I don't ever feel like the work I'm doing makes a difference until somebody tells me, right? I do something, I'm put in a space like today, and then I hear about what I said or what I've done made a difference. So if we reward these kids, put them in the classroom, be like, you did an amazing job. I think these kids really learn from you. I hate to say it, but here's some money to put in your pocket just for doing this. Like, keep coming back. Like, kids, they want money now. That's something to keep them coming back. So I think we just have to meet them where they are. And here our recruiting, I guess, for peer guided education more towards the youth, instead of, adults who already have the jobs, who already get paid to do this. Like, we're already in it, but they are not. They're learning. So
Can I just mention that, just piggybacking off what you said, Janiesha, it's not just money in their pocket. It's access. Those pieces of paper and linen are access to your basic needs and your basic social support for that. I just have to say that.
if I can add, we actually, for Teens on Target specifically, we have we have a workshop, a 6-week workshop, and our first one is the root causes of violence, and it was student-led, student-made, and the first root cause that we discussed is poverty. A lot of these kids, they're depressed because they see somebody in new shoes and they can't get that. It's not always trauma informed or firearm. There are many smaller things, but that can lead to big things. So I think that is one of them. So yeah.
If I may throw one more thing in, we have to acknowledge this. If one is impoverished, a firearm may be a tool to get one's basic needs met. I'm not condoning firearm
But
use.
that is likely. Nowadays, youth are geared towards, if I can't get it, I'm gonna go take it from somebody else. I can't even give a number of how many of my friends that I've seen go hit licks on people, if y'all know what that means, but like go rob people just to get money to go take care of their family and take care of themselves. So it really does start there for our community. We need more money, more jobs. I have students now who are like, I didn't apply to like 5 jobs. I'm trying to save money to go to college, but Youth Alive is the only one paying them. And we try to pay them well, but a real job at this age, you should be a kid. But realistically, a real job at this age can set you up for life. When I went to college, I wished I had a real job. So when I went, I could, be free, finally explore and see outside of Oakland. But we kind of can't, because we're stuck here because we don't really have nothing to get away. So I'm done.
Thank you. I'm going to move to Vice Chair Alvarez, you got your question answered. Thank you. I'm going to move on to Commissioner Rolette, please.
Thank you. And continuing with the theme that was started by Vice Chair Alvarez, first, I wanted to acknowledge just the power of some of the anecdotes that were shared. And in particular, one resonated with me, and that was shared by you, Mr. Vaughn. I have had the unique privilege of being a mentor. And one of the things I hear from Black and Brown kids, I'll use the same language that was used previously by Ms. Grisham, is none of us were born and decided when we were in elementary school, we wanted to be poor and crooks or thieves. That's not the case. But yet here we are. And many of those kids who live in Sacramento will say things like, I've never seen the ocean, or I've never been to Disneyland, or I've never been to the mountains. And they have a perspective on themselves that I think is particularly negative. And so your program, what resonated so much is that you work very hard at giving young people a different view of themselves and the world that they live in. And if you wanted to just say a little bit more about that, because it resonates with me that that is an effective strategy. And then your data tells a story, and your data tells a story about how very effective your program is. And I wanted to compliment you on that.
Well, thank you. As I was talking with one of the commissioners outside, I tell the story, I talk about the numbers, but I never give our office the credit. These folks are making better decisions with how they deal with their conflict, because the conflict is still around. Conflict is there every day, but they choose not to use a gun to deal with the conflict, which is why our numbers are down. So all the credit goes to the young folks in Richmond who started making better decisions. And it is funny you mentioned, because we took folks and we take folks to Disneyland. And it's amazing when you see this dude with gold teeth and dreadlocks with Mickey Mouse ears on, just smiling from ear to ear. We took a group of folks to New York, and they had one of the worst blizzards in decades, the first morning of our trip. And so everything was closed. And we're in Central Park, and 22 and 24-year-old men are doing snow angels and making snowmans. So yeah, I think it's critical. Nope, if you can't see a future, you can't plan for it correctly. And if you don't see a future, you won't plan for it at all. And so we try to get them to a place to where they can see light at the end of the tunnel, because yeah, they're used to fending for themselves. They're the most untrusting group of folks, because to be completely honest, the way they look at it is all they got is to lose. So why would I even engage with you when, you know what I'm saying, I feel like I'm gonna lose no matter the outcome. You're gonna leave just like everybody else does, which is why they do things to try to push you away and take advantage of you, because they don't want to be disappointed. They got abandonment issues. Everybody had given up on them. And so they had given up on themselves. And we said, we're not giving up on you.
I appreciate, not to interrupt, I appreciate that. And I appreciate those two statements. If you don't have a future, how can you plan for one? And that it reflects a commitment to doing the work with human beings and investing in a relationship with people who aren't invested in having a relationship with anyone, and then getting them to transition and then hopefully at some point to reciprocate that. I applaud you, sir, for what you're doing. You're making a tremendous impact on lives, and it shows in how you present the program. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Rolette. I understand, Ms. Grisham, you have to leave us. So thank you again for being here. I am going to, are you going to wrap us up, Dr. Espinoza? I'm going to wrap us up then. Okay.
Does anyone have anything else to add?
Before you wrap us up, can I just?
You were going to wrap us up.
No, I'm not. I'm not going to wrap us up. I'm not going to wrap us up. I'm just going to remind everyone that the next engagement we have for the IFB is on Wednesday, November 8th in, Lassen County. So we will be engaging rural California's firearm owners and veterans, and all commissioners are invited. I hope you guys all come. Now you can wrap us up.
Thank you, Commissioner Betch. Just again, thank you for spending your day with us today. We very much appreciate it. Excellent panel. And with that, at this time, it is time for members of the public to request public comment on agenda item 5 by clicking the raise hand button on your computer or the app. or if calling in by phone, push *9. Once the public comment period for this agenda item starts, we will close the public comment queue. So please make your request to comment now. Also, please limit your comments to 3 minutes or less. Are there any public comments? Please raise your hand now as the queue will be closing. Amadiani, please open the line for public comment on agenda item 5. And we will start with public comments in the room if there are any.
We have 2 comments in the room and then 2 virtual comments. First in the room, we have Tony Robinson.
I want to say first, it's a pleasure and honor to be in front of you all. My name is Tony Robinson. I'm a life coach at the Mentoring Center in Oakland, California. I'm also a former juvenile justice delinquency prevention youth commissioner. So one of the things is I wanted to just to highlight just with the importance of mentoring and life coaching and really emphasizing building those relationships with those young people. And also the young lady, she left, like incentivizing them to be leaders, right? Incentivizing them to be leaders, paying them to be able to take initiative, to be able to actually take charge of their own lives. When you talk about poverty, a lot of the challenges with the young people are due to systemic like racism and you feel me, and oppression that's been passed down through generations. And having to navigate through those challenges makes it very it's a whole, as we know, it's a whole another level of things. It's multi-layered. So one of the things I want to say, especially with dealing with those young people who are in juvenile hall and dealing with violence just in general, with domestic violence, the things that they're seeing in, things that they're seeing in their homes and things that they're seeing in the community are all tied to poverty. And like I said, in general, what you said, generational poverty, right? One of the other things I want to highlight is some of the successes when I have the opportunity to be able to, because I'm one of those young people who grew up in Deep East Oakland. I'm from Oakland, born and raised. And that's part of the reason I actually I'm able to stand, because I had mentors and life coaches that was able to empower me, build relationships with me that pushed me to believe and to be able to imagine the possibility of me wanting to become the mayor of Oakland one day, right? Or to wanting to become a commissioner, or wanting to go into the fire department. So I had to make a decision where I was like, I want to be a frontline healer, or I wanted to be a killer, right? And growing up in a community like that, when violence is real, I had to be able to see the other side of it. And sometimes just with all the distractions with social media and the pressure, the peer pressure and different things like that, connecting to the young people on a real level, and also to the people who's actually doing the work and the teachers and stuff they're not being compensated or paid enough, the therapists and people who are actually on the front lines. I think that'd be better, because sometimes they get burnt out. So I'm also an emergency medical technician as well. So I've saved lives. I come lights and sirens 911, so I take it very seriously. I don't know, I'm kind of all over the place, but I wanted to emphasize the life coaching and building the relationships with the young people on the ground. And they're doing a lot of amazing work with restorative justice, with our joy and, the Department of Violence Prevention in Oakland. So emphasizing and looking into what Oakland is doing, I think it'll be very helpful. And also like really funding those on the community-based organizations.
Thank you, Tony. If you could please wrap up your comment.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Next, we have Steve Wirtz.
Thank you for hearing me. My name is Steve Wirtz. I'm a developmental psychologist by training and also a research scientist. I'm here speaking on my own today, even though I am involved in my community in fairly on-the-ground activities with First Five Sacramento. And I just want to thank the commission for taking on this issue, because I want to argue that gun violence is in fact fully connected to mental health. As a mental health provider, I think it's critical to understand that it's both a cause and a consequence of mental health issues. And I want to point out the one thing I would agree with Commissioner Sheriff Brown on is the intersectionality of the problem of the risk and protective factors for multiple issues. And I think that's such a critical point that you made, that whether we're talking about a mental health issue or whether we're talking about failing in school or getting involved in criminal justice and so on, the underlying risk and protective factors are often very similar and can be addressed in a joint way. As you say, we get the benefit of multiple time benefit if we do the right things around these risk and protective factors. So something I've experienced as a psychologist for this time is that it's been hard for me to see in the mental health field that people truly understand primary prevention. That I continue to argue, I think the literature supports, that mental health issues can be prevented, whether it's schizophrenia or whether it's depression and so on. I know that we talk about all the, brain science and so on, but all of these things are interactive with the environment. And if you create an environment that helps people to meet their needs and so on, you're going to get a change in the population level. So not as a clinician, but as a public health researcher, if you do the right things with young people, you will prevent mental health issues as well as failure in school, as well as crime and so on. So the bottom line message that I would argue that this commission continue to work on, which I know you're already doing some, safe, stable, nurturing relationships and environments will change the world. Many of us experience those in our lives personally, and we benefited from it. But if we can work systematically with targeted universalism, namely taking into account all the disparities we've heard, if we can take that into account, safe, stable, nurturing relationships and environments like the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention have been arguing for the last decade or so would go a long ways. And this commission can move forward upstream.
Thank you, Steve. You could please wrap up your comment.
Thank you so much. I appreciate your work.
Thank you.
Online we have Lori. Your line is open.
Laurie Hallmark, I'm an attorney. So there are a number of on-ramps for the state and federal firearm prohibition registries: felony convictions, substance abuse, domestic violence, protective order, certain types of mental health holds. And while these on-ramps are necessary and important, they are incomplete. Providing an on-ramp enabling people to voluntarily place themselves on the firearm prohibition list is a concrete, relatively simple, uncontroversial way to reduce suicide by firearm. I'm periodically suicidal. I've never attempted it because I've never owned a gun. A couple of months ago, I put my affairs in order, disposed of all personal correspondence, gave away items, handled the necessary financial matters, and created a medical advance directive. But suicide requires an affirmative, determined act. It's not enough to want to not exist. Suicide goes against our basic survival instincts. And as we know, the high-risk time frame is relatively short. When I viewed the mental health system as a source of potential help, the licensing process served as my primary final barrier to suicide. It was a pause, a cue to reach out for help before I possessed the means for follow-through. I used the licensing process as a self-protection method within my recovery. But because I no longer view the mental health system as a potential source of help, the licensing process no longer functions as a barrier to suicide. A couple of months ago, while actively working to obtain a firearm, I suddenly thought about my mother, and even when I don't value my own life, I do value hers. So I reached out to the FBI, the ATF, something called NICS, and tried to put myself on the federal firearm prohibition list. It's possible that you can imagine how this went. I definitely don't recommend it. Providing an on-ramp enabling people to voluntarily place themselves on the firearm prohibition list is a concrete, relatively simple, uncontroversial way to reduce suicide by firearm. I am respectfully requesting that active steps are taken to add an on-ramp, enabling people to voluntarily place themselves on the firearm prohibition registry. This is low-hanging fruit that will save lives and assist recovery. And at some point in the future, when I inevitably fall back into the abyss, it could even save mine. Thank you.
Thank you,
May I
Lori.
comment to that? Just briefly, thank you for your share, attorney. I'm forgetting your name at this moment. Yes, when I'm working with like my supervisees, my students, that is suicide assessment. You look for a plan, intention, and lethal means. If some people volunteer to remove lethal means, that's what prevents suicide. So I bolster what she said.
Thank you. Next, we have Claire Courtwright.
Hi, thank you so much. I just wanted to thank the OAC for a tremendous meeting. I learned a lot and I really appreciated hearing from folks that are doing work in their community based on their lived experience. Oakland, Richmond, I'm from Vallejo, I understand too. And I just really wanted to give y'all some appreciation for bringing folks from the community who don't just talk about what problems are. They're actively involved in solutions. They're actively involved in thinking these issues through very deeply. And I just thought it was a great meeting and I really appreciate you having these speakers. And I learned a lot. Yeah, that's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire.
And that was our last public comment.
Thank you, Mariani.